On the one hand, we've got Putin, who's managed to maintain his iron control over the population through propaganda and repression, all the while claiming that victory is imminent. He threatens the West with both nuclear and conventional attacks, and continues to sacrifice enormous amounts of soldiers and materiel. All the while, Russia's position is deteriorating under the effects of crushing economic sanctions, shrinking war supplies, lack of qualified recruits, and rebellious military contractors. Ukraine is in a slightly better position, as President Volodymyr Zelensky has kept national spirits high, and the country continues to receive huge amounts of advanced military supplies from NATO, the US, and other allies. Even so, Russia continues to occupy large parts of eastern Ukraine, and the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive has made slow progress in retaking the heavily fortified Russian positions. The progress of Ukraine's armed forces, the AFU, largely depends on continued Western military support and high national morale. But with critical elections in many Western countries coming soon, many people have begun to ask how and when the war will come to an end. Hein Goermans, a military historian, expert in territorial conflicts, and University of Rochester professor, recently sat down to discuss the topic on CNN. His interview covered several possible scenarios for the end of the war, and how likely each might be, and just what would be needed for them to actually happen. In this video, we'll go over some of his arguments and dive into what they mean for the coming year. Probably the most important takeaway from Goermans' work is that we shouldn't expect things to wind down anytime soon. He has studied conflicts for decades and concluded that in many cases, wars don't end decisively. World Wars I and II are among the rare instances of major conflicts ending with total victories and the unconditional surrender of the defeated. The US Civil War is another prominent example, although in that case the losing side was not even a fully formed country. However, in most conflicts, both warring parties will do anything necessary to avoid a complete loss. This generally means that they change tactics, make some sort of temporary retreat, or continue fighting at a lower level of intensity to try and wear down their opponents. But for the sake of argument, let's first take a look at what a total victory would actually entail for both sides in the Russo-Ukrainian War. A total Russian victory, which now seems incredibly unlikely, was pretty much the standard assumption when the conflict began in 2022. During the first days of Russia's invasion, it was definitely a real possibility. Troops surged across the border, tanks rolled towards Kyiv, and airstrikes rained down across the country. Putin hoped to quickly encircle and take control of the capital, capture, kill, or drive Zelensky into exile, and set up a puppet government before the West could take actions against him. This nearly worked too. A huge initial advance of Russian troops from Belarus took over Kyiv suburbs and pushed forward towards the city center. But thanks to remarkably clever tactics and pure grit, Ukraine was able to stop the offensive and deny Russian troops access to key points. While the war has since turned into a grinding stalemate of trench warfare, Russia did manage to pull off several surges which at times overwhelmed Ukrainian defenders and could have threatened vital positions. The areas Russia has managed to keep occupying, like the towns of Bakhmut and Soledar, have come at a huge cost. Most are now bombed-out shells, empty of people, and with little real strategic value to either side. Due to the cost of taking these areas, Russia also does not have the military or economic capabilities to actually overrun other parts of Ukraine. As a result, the total Russian victory that Putin has been promising is likely impossible without some major changes to conditions on the ground. But any path he could take to make these happen would also have some serious problems and consequences. For instance, take Putin's threats of resorting to the nuclear option if the West does not cut off its support for Ukraine. The idea has likely been to force their capitulation by presenting himself as willing to impose such high costs that support for Ukraine is no longer worthwhile. But, at least so far, this just hasn't worked. For one thing, no military planners or experts seriously believe that Putin or his generals are truly insane enough to launch a full nuclear strike on NATO targets, a move that would likely result in mutually assured destruction. This leaves the possibility of a limited or tactical nuclear strike on a target inside Ukraine. But while such an attack would no doubt be incredibly deadly, there is little reason to think that it would force Ukraine or its allies to surrender. Instead, a tactical nuke would probably harden Ukrainian resolve even further and cause the West to send its most powerful weapons to the front. It's also unclear how many of Russia's nuclear weapons are actually still effective. Most are Cold War relics which have been sitting in storage for decades with questionable maintenance. The other glaring issue with using a nuclear strike to force Ukrainian surrender is that detonating even a small nuclear device in Ukraine would risk nuclear fallout blowing back into Russia. The last thing Putin wants is to irradiate his own territory, making this a truly impractical option for actually ending the war. But Germans also emphasizes that Putin does have some other options up his sleeve, even if most of them are long shots. One of these revolves around international support, which has been a serious issue for Russia from the beginning. Most of the world has either committed to supporting Ukraine in some fashion or made an effort to stay out of the conflict entirely. While some national leaders like Brazilian President Lula da Silva have blamed both sides and called for an end to the fighting, very few governments have actually given Russia any real support. Those that have are mostly either Russian puppet governments like Belarus or rogue states such as Iran and North Korea who also oppose the West. These two countries have been supplying Russia with most of its outside weaponry, such as the Iranian Shahed kamikaze drones, which have been repeatedly used to attack Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Arms deals like that are the only way for Russia to actually evade sanctions and export bans, but the equipment they provide are not nearly enough to ensure a real victory. This leaves one looming possibility which the West would really like to avoid: China lending its support to Russia's war effort. China's role in the conflict has already proven to be somewhat unique, as Chinese President Xi Jinping has had no issue posing for photos with Putin, who he has called his best and most intimate friend. Since the introduction of sanctions last year, China has become by far Russia's most important economic supporter, with trade between the two reaching an all-time high of $190 billion in 2022. The same year, Russian imports from China increased 13% to $76 billion, and its exports to China increased by 43% to $114 billion. A large part of this is the sale of oil and gas, which have long been Russia's most important economic asset. Some analysts have also argued that China wants Putin to set off an age of conquest, which would form the ideal political backdrop for an invasion of Taiwan. If China did lend its complete support to Putin, there is the possibility that it would make the West nervous enough to push Ukraine's government into some sort of lopsided peace negotiations. However, in many ways, China's support for the invasion is still only superficial. It has not supplied Russia with any lethal weapons, and its government has been vocal that this is not about to change. This is especially true after the 24-hour mutiny of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group and its chief Yevgeny Prigozhin last month, who is now hiding out in Belarus. The defection seems to have made Xi increasingly nervous about supporting a weakened, unpredictable nuclear state on China's border. As Ryan Hass, a top advisor to Barack Obama on China policy, recently wrote in the New York Times, Mr. Xi cannot afford to abandon Mr. Putin altogether. He has invested too much in the relationship, and Russia remains useful to China. But the bromance that has caused so much concern in the West has probably peaked. If Mr. Xi is to achieve his strategic goal of surpassing US strength around the world, he will need to rebalance his foreign policy to account for Mr. Putin's vulnerabilities. That may mean stronger Chinese support for ending a war that has backfired so severely on the Russian leader, and a potentially less confrontational Chinese approach toward the United States and Taiwan. Germans makes a similar point. Basically, as Xi and his government have become aware that fully supporting Putin will undermine their own geopolitical agenda, the chances of Chinese involvement to end the war have plummeted. This leaves Putin with pretty limited options for securing a total victory. One possibility is relying on support from two Eastern European countries where Russia still holds some influence. The first of these is Belarus, where Russian troops could potentially mass and attempt another invasion of Kyiv from the north. However, seeing as this strategy already failed back when Russia hadn't lost nearly 50,000 soldiers and half of all its functioning battle tanks, a similar attack now would probably go even worse, since Ukraine is now armed to the teeth with advanced Western weapon systems and training. The other possibility is the involvement of Moldova, Ukraine's small southwestern neighbor. While Moldova's government is not supportive of Putin or his war, Russia has spent years sponsoring a separatist movement in the east of Moldova on the Ukrainian border. This small region known as Transnistria holds a battalion of Russian troops who has so far stayed out of the conflict in Ukraine. But that could change quickly, as Transnistria could easily become another staging ground for Russian troops to launch an offensive in the south. If coordinated with an attack from Belarus, such a pincer movement could prove to be a serious issue for Kyiv, forcing them to defend from two directions. But again, the odds of this strategy leading to a complete Russian victory are pretty slim. If attempted without Chinese weaponry, such an attack would have to take Ukrainian and Western war planners completely by surprise. Considering how effective intelligence has been at detecting Russian troop movements, there is little chance that this would be possible. The attack would also likely have to utilize some elements of asymmetric warfare, like mounting an effective rural insurgency or assassinating key elements in the Ukrainian command structure. Again, this seems like a very remote possibility. Finally, it would require credible threats of mass destruction from Putin in order to deter a counterstrike, something he hasn't been able to pull off so far. All things considered, there is now only a tiny chance that Russia could achieve a total victory in Ukraine, quite the change from a year and a half ago. So, what are the alternatives? Well, one slightly less distant possibility is that of a Ukrainian victory. While experts and analysts completely dismissed the chance of Ukraine actually winning the war back when it started, after a few weeks, many began to change their minds. As the tide of battle turned and Russian troops were pushed out of Kyiv and forced back into the east, it became clear that Ukrainians stood a chance of coming out on top. This still seems to be the case, although the path to total victory remains very tough. Considering just how badly Russia has fared on the battlefield, as well as its diminishing war supplies, internal defections, and weak economy, it seems logical that Putin cannot continue forever. Ukraine has become increasingly bold as well, vowing to retake every inch of its territory, and even launching drone attacks on Moscow itself. Still, there are several clear obstacles to a Ukrainian victory. First, while Kyiv has gotten enormous amounts of powerful military aid from the West, most of it is ground-based and generally geared towards defensive warfare. NATO countries have so far been quite hesitant about supplying Zelensky with long-range or aerial systems most useful for offense. There remain serious worries about these weapons being used to strike targets inside Russia, and thus escalate the conflict further. This does look to be changing some, as it was recently agreed that Ukraine will receive F-16 fighter jets and the training necessary to fly them. Even so, it's unclear whether the jets will actually allow Ukraine to retake occupied territory, as both sides are a long way from maintaining air superiority. Another big issue could be retaking Crimea. In recent months, Ukraine has become increasingly bold about its intentions to target and eventually retake the peninsula. This has come along with strikes on key arms depots and supply routes, signaling that a Ukrainian push to retake Crimea could come before too long. But actually doing this might be quite the challenge. Despite acknowledging that Crimea is Ukrainian, Western governments have been somewhat hesitant to fully back efforts to retake it, fearing that it could be a red line for Putin. Another issue is Russian fortifications. Recently, satellite imagery of Crimea shows a complex web of trenches, mines, and dragon's teeth set up around Medvedivka, a small town near the border of mainland Ukraine. The most likely strategy for Ukrainian forces would be to try and break through the land corridor between Crimea and the mainland, heading from Zaporizhia towards Melitopol and the Azov Sea. Doing so could split the Russian forces in two, while cutting off major supply routes into Crimea. Unfortunately, to do so, Ukrainian armor and ground units will have to get through the minefields, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and numerous other hazards, while also taking heavy fire from Russian artillery and drones. All of this means that a lightning offensive to retake the area will be difficult and very bloody. Ukrainian commanders know this, and are likely trying to bide their time until more cracks in the Russian defenses begin to show. That brings us to the most likely possibility for how the war in Ukraine ends, that it doesn't, at least not anytime soon. There is a good chance that the conflict becomes a lower intensity, simmering conflict, with both sides trying to outlast the other. This type of war of attrition is quite common, especially when neither side has a clear path to victory. It also seems likely that Kyiv could bank on such a conflict going their way. Since Russia's international support is probably not increasing much, Ukraine may try to take back towns and cities where it can, forcing Russian troops to fight bitterly for every inch of territory, while whittling away at its troops and supplies a little more every week. With no real way to replace them, such a scenario definitely doesn't favor Russia. At some point, Ukraine may decide that Russian positions have been weakened enough to mount a final offensive on Crimea, or it may act more slowly, maintaining constant pressure and constricting supply lines until things become unsustainable. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov recently stated that he believed Ukraine can retake its territory by the middle of 2024, but it remains to be seen whether that is actually possible. The scary thing with a war of attrition is that as things get more and more dire, Putin may become desperate enough to do something truly stupid. Even if Ukraine is able to slowly retake all of its territory, Putin still has enough missiles to conceivably keep bombarding the country from across the border. If this is the case, then the only thing that can really stop Putin is him ending up in prison or 6 feet under, otherwise known as a Russian retirement plan. Unfortunately, even if Putin is removed, there is no guarantee that his successor will be better. Some officials in Russia have been even more vocally pro-war than the man himself, and if they took over, it seems unlikely things would just end. But let's say that Putin or his successor finally sees the light and agrees to enter into negotiations with Kyiv. Some people would think that this would magically turn into a lasting peace, but the truth of the matter is that that is far from certain. According to data from the US Institute for Peace, up to 50% of peace agreements between warring parties break down within 5 years. Even when both sides know that continuing the war will be incredibly costly, there is a strong incentive to avoid giving concessions to the enemy or show weakness, especially in a brutal winner-takes-all political system such as Russia's. This spoiling effect means that it is difficult to make peace last without an absolute victory for one side, and suggests that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia wouldn't last very long, even if they managed to agree on terms. Successful peace deals are also very hard to carry out logistically, often involving partition, power sharing, autonomous zones, and other mechanisms which can easily devolve into more violence. In any negotiations, Putin and his supporters would almost certainly demand that some or all of eastern Ukraine remain under Russian control, or at least be politically independent from Kyiv. Considering that Putin still claims all of Russian-speaking Ukraine as his own, that the country's Jewish president is a Nazi, and that Ukraine was never really independent in the first place, the chance of negotiations producing results is not very good. So to sum things up, from the perspective of Germans and many other experts, the most likely way for the war in Ukraine to end is to not really end. Fighting will probably continue for quite a long time, but at a lower intensity of violence than during the first year or two of the war. Trenches and minefields will probably remain in place, and missiles will continue to needlessly kill Ukrainians who just want to live normal lives. And that's one of the biggest tragedies with wars. They are much easier to start than to stop. When Putin let the genie out of the bottle in 2014 and then again in 2022, he created a situation where violence may continue for years to come. Like so many other places, eastern Ukraine will remain a perpetual conflict zone, where nobody is really safe, and things can never truly go back to the way they were. While such a messy ending is far from ideal, as Germans makes clear, it is the most realistic outcome on the horizon. But what do you think? Will the war end in a real victory for one side? Or will this be another example of a simmering conflict with no real end? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Where and when will the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive come? And what expectations should we have for it? Will it be a decisive battle that ends the war, or do we have to be far more cautious about its prospects of success? One retired American brigadier general and the moves the Ukrainians have made in June in what appears to be the initial stage of the broader counteroffensive can give us clues about what we should expect for the coming months. Let's take a look. After Russian gains in Donbass in the early summer of 2022, Ukraine launched counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, which stunned the world. These two campaigns were far more successful than anyone had imagined they would be. Then the fighting stalled as the first muddy season and then the winter set in. Russia once again made slow, grinding gains in Donbass, finally capturing the city of Bakhmut at the end of May 2023, after 9 months of fighting. During that time, international observers and military experts anticipated a Ukrainian counteroffensive, especially as the Ukrainians requested, and were granted, hundreds of advanced Western battle tanks like the American Abrams, British Challenger, and German Leopard 2. However, the expected offensive did not materialize in the early spring, as many hoped it would, Ukraine was probably waiting for the delivery of those advanced tanks and other munitions in order to launch the counteroffensive from the strongest possible position. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal from May 17th, Ukraine carried out drone attacks behind Russian lines during that month. The purpose of these attacks was twofold. First, these strikes would weaken Russian positions. Second, they are also surveillance operations, as the Ukrainians seek out points of vulnerability in the Russian lines, which would prove the most promising places to attack for the broader counteroffensive. The current front line in Ukraine as of about June 15, 2023, stretches over 900 miles, from the area around Kherson in the south, through Zaporizhia and Donbass, and up to the Russian border in the north. Trying to pinpoint the exact location of a counteroffensive along such an extended front is always a difficult challenge, but there are certain areas that would make sense from a strategic or political perspective for Ukraine to try and attack. What are these areas? What value would come from attacking them, and what would the prospects for success be along each of these potential offensive axes? What are the respective strengths and weaknesses of each potential route? What are the risks involved in each strategy? In a May interview for the Wall Street Journal, retired American Brigadier General Mark Kimmett pointed out what he believed would be the four most likely scenarios for the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. The first option would be a direct attack from Kherson across the Dnieper River to the Sea of Azov. The rewards involved in such a strategy would be obvious. If successful, a counteroffensive along this axis would cut the land bridge from Crimea to the other Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine and cut it almost in its entirety. As we've often mentioned on this channel, Crimea is of vital importance, not only for the Russian war effort, but to Russia's entire geopolitical strategy and to Putin's political image. It is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and one of its few warm water ports. Crimea is also a supply hub for the Russian forces in Ukraine. This is the reason why the southern offensive from Crimea was by far Russia's most successful campaign in the earliest days of the war. Cutting the supply line to and from Crimea would not only threaten Russian forces in Ukraine, but Russian control over the peninsula itself. The explosion on the Kerch Bridge last fall showed how vulnerable Crimea is. If the land bridge connecting it with the Russian border goes, Crimea would be limited to being supplied by sea or over that same bridge, a piece of infrastructure that has already proven vulnerable to attack. The route from Kherson to the Sea of Azov would be the shortest possible path to cutting the land bridge to Crimea. If the Ukrainians were to successfully carry out such an operation, Crimea would essentially be put under siege. Meanwhile, the other Russian forces in Ukraine would lose one of their most important supply lines. On the Russian home front, Vladimir Putin's image among the high-ups in the Kremlin and with the Russian general public would be seriously damaged if control over Crimea is substantially threatened by such battlefield developments. His image has already come under stress thanks to military failures, economic hardship, and the botched wave of mobilization he announced last fall. The last thing he needs would be to see Crimea threatened. The consequences of this possibility on the Russian home front would add even more momentum to the Ukrainian war effort in the field. There are daunting problems that would come with this option, however. Attacking directly from Kherson would involve crossing the broad Dnieper River straight into the teeth of the Russian fortifications on the other side. The Russian positions there would also be some of the best supplied, thanks to their proximity to Crimea. Unless the Ukrainians managed to achieve surprise, casualties would be very high. Even if the Ukrainians do manage to accomplish their initial objectives on the opposite side of the river, they would need to rapidly expand their bridgehead or get pushed back into the water by well-supplied Russian reinforcements. This option, therefore, is the highest risk, highest reward one. Most observers do not expect the Ukrainians to take such a risk, though that may work in their favor if they try to pull it off. Taking a risk that your enemy does not believe you will take is one of the oldest ways of creating surprise on the battlefield, a tradition which stretches all the way back to ancient Egypt. It was perhaps for this reason that a strange incident occurred recently. The destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam in early June further complicated the prospect of the Kherson line of attack. Both sides blamed each other for the dam's destruction. Since the destruction of this dam could affect the water supply for an otherwise arid Crimea, some watchers find it unlikely that Russia would deliberately destroy it. However, the dam's destruction has now turned vast swathes of land on the opposite bank from Kherson into a flooded area that Ukrainian vehicles cannot penetrate. Russian forces also controlled the dam prior to its destruction, making them the likeliest culprits. It has therefore made the Kherson to the Sea of Azov route an all but impossible one for Ukraine to attempt at this time, allowing Russia to more fully concentrate its forces on other, more likely axes of advance for the Ukrainian armed forces. As expected, there is no significant movement along this sector as of about June 15, 2023. According to General Kimmit, the second possible option for the counteroffensive would also cut the land bridge to Crimea if it succeeds, but the route would be longer. It would lance down from Zaporizhia to the city of Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov. There are many advantages to this route. It does not involve a risky amphibious operation. The route has a robust network that would make transit and supply easier. The roads would be able to support the tanks and armored vehicles that would lead the attack on the ground. Many observers have considered the Zaporizhia strategy as the likeliest one. Previous Russian attacks in the area have not been successful, as the intensity of the invaders' resources has been directed toward Bakhmut and other targets in the Donbas region. The downside to this strategy is that there are major Russian fortifications in the area. Russia has long anticipated that the Zaporizhia strategy is in Ukraine's sweet spot of doable and rewarding. It has therefore taken pains to fortify the area and make a counteroffensive there costly. Even so, the Zaporizhia strategy is likely the most promising option for the counteroffensive, especially given that most Russian forces are still concentrated in Donbas. Recent activity suggests that the Ukrainians are probably attempting this route, but we will get into those details later. If either of these two strategies were to succeed, all Russian forces east of the Ukrainian line to the Sea of Azov would be cut from Crimea. Any supply disruptions from the peninsula would severely threaten their continued existence. Meanwhile, the Russian troops west of the line would be trapped in a giant pocket, and as the Ukrainians get closer to Crimea, more and more of its vital infrastructure, including the Kerch Bridge, would come into the range of HIMARS and other weapon systems. Understandably, Russia will try to prevent these scenarios from unfolding at all costs. Kimmit says that a third route for the Ukrainian counteroffensive could come further north and east by way of Donbas, the region which has seen the heaviest fighting in the war. The route would start in Donetsk and move to Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Like the two other routes, it would cut the land bridge to Crimea, but only partially. The land bridge would no longer connect to the Russian border, but there would still be a large area connecting Crimea to a big percentage of the Russian forces in Ukraine. As such, the supply routes from and to Crimea would not be as well disrupted and the Russian forces within the cut-off area not nearly as imperiled as they would be via the Kherson or Zaporizhia routes. For these reasons, Kimmit is less enthusiastic about this option. He believes it would not significantly alter the military balance of power in Ukraine even if it succeeds, meaning that casualties would probably come at a high price for little gain. However, the Donetsk to Mariupol strategy would have one significant plus. It would be a major propaganda and morale win for the Ukrainians. Mariupol was the first big city that the Russians captured in the war. Most of us remember the headlines of the Mariupol pocket and the weeks of fighting that ended with a last stand in the city's steel plant. A scenario that ends with Ukraine retaking Mariupol would be a big blow to Russian morale and Putin's prestige. It would also be a signal to the West, which has begun to show some signs that its commitment to Ukraine is not open-ended. The recapture of Mariupol would demonstrate Ukraine's ability to make further gains, which is critical for its ability to maintain Western support at a high level. Such a symbolic target falling back into Ukrainian hands would be a symbolic image that Western leaders and the general public would find difficult to ignore. Kimmit's fourth scenario would be an eastern offensive from Kharkiv through Luhansk. This axis is a short route that would, if completely successful, reach the Russian border. This route would avoid the Sea of Azov and thus leave the land bridge from the Russian border to Crimea fully intact. However, like the Donetsk and Mariupol offensive, it would have a significant propaganda value if it succeeds. It would retake the land that Ukrainians lost in 2014, when Russia threw its support behind the self-declared breakaway republics in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The loss of these territories, which contained the seeds of the full-scale war, would be another blow to Russian morale and a signal to the Ukrainian people and the Western powers. It would be a successful offensive that demonstrates Ukraine's continued ability to make gains, even into long-held pro-Russian areas. The offensive would send the message that Ukraine's war effort is therefore worthy of continued Western support. A successful offensive to the Russian border in Luhansk would also open up more Russian territory to long-range precision strikes from HIMARS or to raids like that seen in Belgorod in May. Given how disruptive the Belgorod raid was while using relatively few assets, the advantages of keeping the Kremlin guessing about where new raids or strikes into additional stretches of Russian territory might come from should not be underestimated. On the downside, this strategy too would not significantly alter the military balance of power in Ukraine, since Crimea would remain free to supply most of the Russian forces along the front. Indeed, the front line itself would change relatively little from where it is now, with Russian forces controlling a vast swathe of Ukrainian territory and able to resupply and reinforce one another all along that war zone. Casualties would therefore be dearly bought for relatively little gained on the battlefield. Recent Ukrainian activities, however, suggest that this axis may be an item on their agenda. General Kimmich warned to not place expectations for the counteroffensive too high. He does not believe that the Ukrainians will be in position to rout the Russians and drive them from all of the territories they have occupied in Ukraine's borders since 2014. He does not even expect the war to end in 2023. Rather, he is paying attention to how deep the Ukrainians can drive into Russian-occupied territory, which would preferably be, as far as the water, the Sea of Azov. They've got to decisively defeat the Russians for this to be a successful counterattack, and it's got to be successful enough that it will continue to inspire the West to provide material and equipment for the next counterattack, and the next counterattack after that, because this will certainly not end the war, he said. To sum it all up, General Kimmich believes that the Ukrainians can launch a successful counteroffensive that would alter the military situation in the war and stagger the Russians, but he does not believe that the Russian war effort will collapse as a result. Instead, this offensive will be one of many in a war that lasts at least into 2024. After some shaping operations that involved HIMARS and other artillery and drone strike on important Russian assets in May, the first phase of the proper Ukrainian counteroffensive finally seemed to begin in the second week of June. On June 9th, Vladimir Putin declared in a video interview published to Telegram, "We can definitely state that this Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun." Putin also claimed that attempted Ukrainian attacks on Russian positions had failed with heavy casualties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also seemed to confirm that the counteroffensive had finally begun, saying on June 11th, "Counteroffensive and defensive actions are taking place." He refused to go into any further detail on the nature of the operations. Zelensky called Putin's claims of high Ukrainian casualties interesting. The scale of the operations has so far been limited. The Ukrainians are attacking along three axes. The first is around Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast. The second is the Valkaya-Novosilka axis, also in Donetsk. The third is around Russian-occupied Tokmak in Zaporizhia Oblast. The Ukrainians seem to be trying to draw the Russians into committing their reserves along these three axes. Once this is done, and Russian assets are stretched thin, they can try to effect a breakthrough in their desired sector. The Ukrainians have not yet made the type of progress they made in the counteroffensives of last year, but have advanced about 10 kilometers on all three fronts, targeting critical enemy assets like artillery and air defense batteries, communication hubs, and supply depots. Reports indicate that Russian helicopters have been unusually aggressive in striking against the attacking Ukrainians, slowing the attacks down and causing heavier casualties. The Ukrainians have also lost some of the Western tanks and armored fighting vehicles they have recently been supplied with. Russian drone attacks have also been far more effective than last year, as the Ukrainians do not seem to be doing a great job of moving their air defense equipment forward along with the front line. The Ukrainians also appear to be moving slowly because of a lack of their own air support thanks to a dearth of jet fighters which the Western powers are still reluctant to supply them with. Images of captured Russian self-propelled artillery systems which are swirling around some Ukrainian social media accounts have led some observers to believe that the Ukrainian advance has been more than the reported 10 kilometers. This speculation comes because the Russians would probably deploy these assets further back from the front lines. As always with an ongoing military operation, we will need to wait and see how true this assertion is. It is too early in the operation to say for sure which of the three axes is the main objective in Ukraine's strategy, although the Tokmak axis may be the most promising. An offensive along this route would be in line with General Kimmich's second scenario, with Berdyansk and the Sea of Azov as the main objective. In comparison, the other two axes are relatively lacking in strategic promise. The Tokmak area has heavy Russian fortifications along the front line which Ukraine would need to break through, so diverting Russian reserves to Bakhmut and Valkaya-Novosilka would be important for the viability of the counteroffensive. These two other axes therefore may be feints for the real offensive around Tokmak. the stakes for Ukraine are high. If they can indeed reach Berdyansk, break the Russians' control of the Sea of Azov, and cut the land bridge to Crimea as General Kimmich hopes, they will not only significantly alter the military balance of power, but it is likely that they will also continue to secure strong Western support going into 2024. On the other hand, if the rest of the year goes by with only partial success, or none at all, it is far likelier that political pressure in Western countries will ramp up on forcing a negotiated settlement to the war on much more unfavorable terms for Ukraine. With recession looming over the United Kingdom and other countries, it will become a lot harder for Western leaders to justify large expenditures on a cause that appears to be stagnant or fading. The Ukrainians do not have long to achieve their objectives for this year. By November or so, the fall rainy season will arrive and turn the open ground into perilous, muddy terrain, making the movement of supply vehicles, artillery and tanks or other heavy fighting vehicles difficult or impossible. The front will therefore stall just as it did last year. All wars are first and foremost political, and launched with political objectives. For Ukraine, securing Western support for the long term is its most important such objective, which means that for the counteroffensive, demonstrating the continued ability to win on a large scale is the first item on the agenda. Although cutting the Russians' land bridge to Crimea would make the most sense from a purely military standpoint, the political objective of securing long-term Western support is even more important. If the Ukrainian counteroffensive makes enough gains to ensure that support into the next year, Kyiv will likely consider it a success. The last thing the Ukrainian government wants is to be forced to the negotiating table at this point in the war, with Russia still occupying an extent of Ukrainian territory that matches the size of Iceland. To reclaim all of its pre-2014 territory, or as much of it as possible, the Ukrainians will need to repeatedly demonstrate that they can not only withstand Russian assaults, but win and continue to drive them back. If the Tokmak Axis is indeed the main attempted counteroffensive, the question will be, how close can Ukraine get to the Sea of Azov before the rains come? The answer to that question will be a big determining factor in the conduct of the war heading into 2024. But what do you think? Which of these counteroffensive scenarios would most likely ensure Ukraine's success in the Russo-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Where and when will the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive come? And what expectations should we have for it? Will it be a decisive battle that ends the war, or do we have to be far more cautious about its prospects of success? One retired American brigadier general and the moves the Ukrainians have made in June in what appears to be the initial stage of the broader counteroffensive can give us clues about what we should expect for the coming months. Let's take a look. After Russian gains in Donbass in the early summer of 2022, Ukraine launched counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, which stunned the world. These two campaigns were far more successful than anyone had imagined they would be. Then the fighting stalled as the first muddy season and then the winter set in. Russia once again made slow, grinding gains in Donbass, finally capturing the city of Bakhmut at the end of May 2023, after 9 months of fighting. During that time, international observers and military experts anticipated a Ukrainian counteroffensive, especially as the Ukrainians requested, and were granted, hundreds of advanced Western battle tanks like the American Abrams, British Challenger, and German Leopard 2. However, the expected offensive did not materialize in the early spring, as many hoped it would. Ukraine was probably waiting for the delivery of those advanced tanks and other munitions in order to launch the counteroffensive from the strongest possible position. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal from May 17th, Ukraine carried out drone attacks behind Russian lines during that month. The purpose of these attacks was twofold. First, these strikes would weaken Russian positions. Second, they are also surveillance operations, as the Ukrainians seek out points of vulnerability in the Russian lines, which would prove the most promising places to attack for the broader counteroffensive. The current front line in Ukraine as of about June 15, 2023, stretches over 900 miles, from the area around Kherson in the south, through Zaporizhia and Donbass, and up to the Russian border in the north. Trying to pinpoint the exact location of a counteroffensive along such an extended front is always a difficult challenge, but there are certain areas that would make sense from a strategic or political perspective for Ukraine to try and attack. What are these areas? What value would come from attacking them, and what would the prospects for success be along each of these potential offensive axes. What are the respective strengths and weaknesses of each potential route? What are the risks involved in each strategy? In a May interview for the Wall Street Journal, retired American Brigadier General Mark Kimmett pointed out what he believed would be the four most likely scenarios for the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. The first option would be a direct attack from Kherson across the Dnieper River to the Sea of Azov. The rewards involved in such a strategy would be obvious. If successful, a counteroffensive along this axis would cut the land bridge from Crimea to the other Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine and cut it almost in its entirety. As we've often mentioned on this channel, Crimea is of vital importance, not only for the Russian war effort, but to Russia's entire geopolitical strategy and to Putin's political image. It is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and one of its few warm water ports. Crimea is also a supply hub for the Russian forces in Ukraine. This is the reason why the southern offensive from Crimea was by far Russia's most successful campaign in the earliest days of the war. Cutting the supply line to and from Crimea would not only threaten Russian forces in Ukraine, but Russian control over the peninsula itself. The explosion on the Kerch Bridge last fall showed how vulnerable Crimea is. If the land bridge connecting it with the Russian border goes, Crimea would be limited to being supplied by sea or over that same bridge, a piece of infrastructure that has already proven vulnerable to attack. The route from Kherson to the Sea of Azov would be the shortest possible path to cutting the land bridge to Crimea. If the Ukrainians were to successfully carry out such an operation, Crimea would essentially be put under siege. Meanwhile, the other Russian forces in Ukraine would lose one of their most important supply lines. On the Russian home front, Vladimir Putin's image, among the high-ups in the Kremlin and with the Russian general public, would be seriously damaged if control over Crimea is substantially threatened by such battlefield developments. His image has already come under stress thanks to military failures, economic hardship, and the botched wave of mobilization he announced last fall. The last thing he needs would be to see Crimea threatened. The consequences of this possibility on the Russian home front would add even more momentum to the Ukrainian war effort in the field. There are daunting problems that would come with this option, however. Attacking directly from Kherson would involve crossing the broad Dnieper River straight into the teeth of the Russian fortifications on the other side. The Russian positions there would also be some of the best supplied, thanks to their proximity to Crimea. Unless the Ukrainians managed to achieve surprise, casualties would be very high. Even if the Ukrainians do manage to accomplish their initial objectives on the opposite side of the river, they would need to rapidly expand their bridgehead or get pushed back into the water by well-supplied Russian reinforcements. This option therefore is the highest risk, highest reward one. Most observers do not expect the Ukrainians to take such a risk, though that may work in their favor if they try to pull it off. Taking a risk that your enemy does not believe you will take is one of the oldest ways of creating surprise on the battlefield, a tradition which stretches all the way back to ancient Egypt. It was perhaps for this reason that a strange incident occurred recently. The destruction of the Nova Kakhovka Dam in early June further complicated the prospect of the Kherson line of attack. Both sides blamed each other for the dam's destruction. Since the destruction of this dam could affect the water supply for an otherwise arid Crimea, some watchers find it unlikely that Russia would deliberately destroy it. However, the dam's destruction has now turned vast swathes of land on the opposite bank from Kherson into a flooded area that Ukrainian vehicles cannot penetrate. Russian forces also controlled the dam prior to its destruction, making them the likeliest culprits. It has therefore made the Kherson to the Sea of Azov route an all but impossible one for Ukraine to attempt at this time, allowing Russia to more fully concentrate its forces on other, more likely axes of advance for the Ukrainian armed forces. As expected, there is no significant movement along this sector as of about June 15, 2023. According to General Kimmett, the second possible option for the counteroffensive would also cut the land bridge to Crimea if it succeeds, but the route would be longer. It would lance down from Zaporizhia to the city of Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov. There are many advantages to this route. It does not involve a risky amphibious operation. The route has a robust network that would make transit and supply easier. The roads would be able to support the tanks and armored vehicles that would lead the attack on the ground. Many observers have considered the Zaporizhia strategy as the likeliest one. Previous Russian attacks in the area have not been successful, as the intensity of the invaders' resources has been directed toward Bakhmut and other targets in the Donbas region. The downside to this strategy is that there are major Russian fortifications in the area. Russia has long anticipated that the Zaporizhzhia strategy is in Ukraine's sweet spot of doable and rewarding. It has therefore taken pains to fortify the area and make a counteroffensive there costly. Even so, the Zaporizhzhia strategy is likely the most promising option for the counteroffensive, especially given that most Russian forces are still concentrated in Donbass. Recent activity suggests that the Ukrainians are probably attempting this route, but we will get into those details later. If either of these two strategies were to succeed, all Russian forces east of the Ukrainian line to the Sea of Azov would be cut from Crimea. Any supply disruptions from the peninsula would severely threaten their continued existence. Meanwhile, the Russian troops west of the line would be trapped in a giant pocket, and as the Ukrainians get closer to Crimea, more and more of its vital infrastructure, including the Kerch Bridge, would come into the range of HIMARS and other weapon systems. Understandably, Russia will try to prevent these scenarios from unfolding at all costs. Kimmich says that a third route for the Ukrainian counteroffensive could come further north and east by way of Donbass, the region which has seen the heaviest fighting in the war. The route would start in Donetsk and move to Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Like the two other routes, it would cut the land bridge to Crimea, but only partially. The land bridge would no longer connect to the Russian border, but there would still be a large area connecting Crimea to a big percentage of the Russian forces in Ukraine. As such, the supply routes from and to Crimea would not be as well disrupted and the Russian forces within the cut-off area not nearly as imperiled as they would be via the Kherson or Zaporizhzhia routes. For these reasons, Kimmich is less enthusiastic about this option. He believes it would not significantly alter the military balance of power in Ukraine even if it succeeds, meaning that casualties would probably come at a high price for little gain. However, the Donetsk to Mariupol strategy would have one significant plus. It would be a major propaganda and morale win for the Ukrainians. Mariupol was the first big city that the Russians captured in the war. Most of us remember the headlines of the Mariupol pocket and the weeks of fighting that ended with a last stand in the city's steel plant. A scenario that ends with Ukraine retaking Mariupol would be a big blow to Russian morale and Putin's prestige. It would also be a signal to the West, which has begun to show some signs that its commitment to Ukraine is not open-ended. The recapture of Mariupol would demonstrate Ukraine's ability to make further gains, which is critical for its ability to maintain Western support at a high level. Such a symbolic target falling back into Ukrainian hands would be a symbolic image that Western leaders and the general public would find difficult to ignore. Kimmich's fourth scenario would be an eastern offensive from Kharkiv through Luhansk. This axis is a short route that would, if completely successful, reach the Russian border. This route would avoid the Sea of Azov and thus leave the land bridge from the Russian border to Crimea fully intact. However, like the Donetsk and Mariupol offensive, it would have a significant propaganda value if it succeeds. It would retake the land that Ukrainians lost in 2014, when Russia threw its support behind the self-declared breakaway republics in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The loss of these territories, which contained the seeds of the full-scale war, would be another blow to Russian morale and a signal to the Ukrainian people and the Western powers. It would be a successful offensive that demonstrates Ukraine's continued ability to make gains, even into long-held pro-Russian areas. The offensive would send the message that Ukraine's war effort is therefore worthy of continued Western support. A successful offensive to the Russian border in Luhansk would also open up more Russian territory to long-range precision strikes from HIMARS or to raids like that seen in Belgorod in May. Given how disruptive the Belgorod raid was while using relatively few assets, the advantages of keeping the Kremlin guessing about where new raids or strikes into additional stretches of Russian territory might come from should not be underestimated. On the downside, this strategy too would not significantly alter the military balance of power in Ukraine, since Crimea would remain free to supply most of the Russian forces along the front. Indeed, the front line itself would change relatively little from where it is now, with Russian forces controlling a vast swathe of Ukrainian territory and able to resupply and reinforce one another all along that war zone. Casualties would therefore be dearly bought for relatively little gained on the battlefield. Recent Ukrainian activities, however, suggest that this axis may be an item on their agenda. General Kimmich warned to not place expectations for the counteroffensive too high. He does not believe that the Ukrainians will be in position to rout the Russians and drive them from all of the territories they have occupied in Ukraine's borders since 2014. He does not even expect the war to end in 2023. Rather, he is paying attention to how deep the Ukrainians can drive into Russian-occupied territory, which would preferably be as far as the water, the Sea of Azov. They've got to decisively defeat the Russians for this to be a successful counterattack, and it's got to be successful enough that it will continue to inspire the West to provide material and equipment for the next counterattack, and the next counterattack after that, because this will certainly not end the war, he said. To sum it all up, General Kimmich believes that the Ukrainians can launch a successful counteroffensive that would alter the military situation in the war and stagger the Russians, but he does not believe that the Russian war effort will collapse as a result. Instead, this offensive will be one of many in a war that lasts at least into 2024. After some shaping operations that involved HIMARS and other artillery and drone strike on important Russian assets in May, the first phase of the proper Ukrainian counteroffensive finally seemed to begin in the second week of June. On June 9th, Vladimir Putin declared in a video interview published to Telegram, "We can definitely state that this Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun." Putin also claimed that attempted Ukrainian attacks on Russian positions had failed with heavy casualties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also seemed to confirm that the counteroffensive had finally begun, saying on June 11th, "Counteroffensive and defensive actions are taking place." He refused to go into any further detail on the nature of the operations. Zelensky called Putin's claims of high Ukrainian casualties interesting. The scale of the operations has so far been limited. The Ukrainians are attacking along three axes. The first is around Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast. The second is the Valkaya-Novosilka axis, also in Donetsk. The third is around Russian-occupied Tokmak in Zaporizhia Oblast. The Ukrainians seem to be trying to draw the Russians into committing their reserves along these three axes. Once this is done, and Russian assets are stretched thin, they can try to effect a breakthrough in their desired sector. The Ukrainians have not yet made the type of progress they made in the counteroffensives of last year, but have advanced about 10 kilometers on all three fronts, targeting critical enemy assets like artillery and air defense batteries, communication hubs, and supply depots. Reports indicate that Russian helicopters have been unusually aggressive in striking against the attacking Ukrainians, slowing the attacks down and causing heavier casualties. The Ukrainians have also lost some of the Western tanks and armored fighting vehicles they have recently been supplied with. Russian drone attacks have also been far more effective than last year, as the Ukrainians do not seem to be doing a great job of moving their air defense equipment forward along with the front line. The Ukrainians also appear to be moving slowly because of a lack of their own air support thanks to a dearth of jet fighters which the Western powers are still reluctant to supply them with. Images of captured Russian self-propelled artillery systems which are swirling around some Ukrainian social media accounts have led some observers to believe that the Ukrainian advance has been more than the reported 10 kilometers. This speculation comes because the Russians would probably deploy these assets further back from the front lines. As always with an ongoing military operation, we will need to wait and see how true this assertion is. It is too early in the operation to say for sure which of the three axes is the main objective in Ukraine's strategy, although the Tokmak axis may be the most promising. An offensive along this route would be in line with General Kimmich's second scenario, with Berdyansk and the Sea of Azov as the main objective. In comparison, the other two axes are relatively lacking in strategic promise. The Tokmak area has heavy Russian fortifications along the front line which Ukraine would need to break through, so diverting Russian reserves to Bakhmut and Valkaya-Novosilka would be important for the viability of the counteroffensive. These two other axes therefore may be feints for the real offensive around Tokmak. The stakes for Ukraine are high. If they can indeed reach Berdyansk, break the Russians' control of the Sea of Azov, and cut the land bridge to Crimea as General Kimmich hopes, they will not only significantly alter the military balance of power, but it is likely that they will also continue to secure strong Western support going into 2024. On the other hand, if the rest of the year goes by with only partial success, or none at all, it is far likelier that political pressure in Western countries will ramp up on forcing a negotiated settlement to the war on much more unfavorable terms for Ukraine. With recession looming over the United Kingdom and other countries, it will become a lot harder for Western leaders to justify large expenditures on a cause that appears to be stagnant or fading. The Ukrainians do not have long to achieve their objectives for this year. By November or so, the fall rainy season will arrive and turn the open ground into perilous, muddy terrain, making the movement of supply vehicles, artillery and tanks or other heavy fighting vehicles difficult or impossible. The front will therefore stall just as it did last year. All wars are first and foremost political. and launched with political objectives. For Ukraine, securing Western support for the long term is its most important such objective, which means that for the counteroffensive, demonstrating the continued ability to win on a large scale is the first item on the agenda. Although cutting the Russians' land bridge to Crimea would make the most sense from a purely military standpoint, the political objective of securing long-term Western support is even more important. If the Ukrainian counteroffensive makes enough gains to ensure that support into the next year, Kyiv will likely consider it a success. The last thing the Ukrainian government wants is to be forced to the negotiating table at this point in the war, with Russia still occupying an extent of Ukrainian territory that matches the size of Iceland. To reclaim all of its pre-2014 territory, or as much of it as possible, the Ukrainians will need to repeatedly demonstrate that they can not only withstand Russian assaults, but win and continue to drive them back. If the Tokmak Axis is indeed the main attempted counteroffensive, the question will be, how close can Ukraine get to the Sea of Azov before the rains come? The answer to that question will be a big determining factor in the conduct of the war heading into 2024. But what do you think? Which of these counteroffensive scenarios would most likely ensure Ukraine's success in the Russo-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. If you've been watching the news recently, it's no secret that things aren't going well for Russian President Vladimir Putin. In fact, according to former CIA Chief of Russian Operations Steve Hall, Putin's troubles are mounting at breakneck speed, and they might just be enough to break the infamous dictator. In this video, let's take a look at some of Hall's predictions about what might happen in Ukraine and just how much trouble Russia and its leader are really in. To start with, let's consider firepower. It's hard to turn on a TV without seeing something about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asking for more ammunition. For instance, there have been multiple high-profile stories about how Ukraine's air defenses are short on missiles, leading some to speculate that Russia's air force would finally gain control of the skies and crush Ukrainian resistance. But the truth was far less ominous. Ukrainians had simply stated that at the current burn rate of ammunition, they might run out in a few months, not right away. In much the same way, there have been multiple stories on Ukraine facing shortages of shells for its artillery and other systems like the HIMARS rockets. But what these reports don't capture is that Russia is having the same type of problems, just on a far larger scale. Russian ammunition shortages have become just as severe as those on the Ukrainian side. But unlike Ukraine, Russia does not have the same huge coalition of powerful and well-armed Western allies willing to send it more materiel. Instead, its allies are limited to Iran, Belarus, and, reportedly, South Africa, China, and a few others. To date, the main advantage Russia has had over Ukraine comes from its Soviet legacy. Modern Russia contains massive stockpiles of Soviet weaponry and equipment, left over from the enormous arms buildups of the Cold War. However, after more than a year of war in Ukraine, that stockpile is closer than ever to being depleted. One sign of this came several months ago when Ukraine announced that for the first time, it had achieved artillery parity with Russia. Throughout most of the conflict, Russia had fired more than 20 times the shells of Ukraine, but for the first time, they began firing the same volume of shells, substantially leveling the playing field. This was aided by HIMARS strikes and sabotage of ammunition depots far behind Russian lines, so that by early to mid-2023, Ukraine was outfiring Russia 6-1. As Hall has noted, I think the pattern that we've seen over this year, the first year of the Ukrainian war, has been the West very slowly, very cautiously, I think probably not to overwhelm Ukrainian logistics capabilities, ramping up the type of weaponry and ammunition that goes with that. The huge shift in firepower had a noticeable effect on Russia's attempted offensive operations. Due to the poor training, planning, and leadership of Russian ground troops, most of their operations during the war have been heavily reliant on huge artillery barrages. But once their overwhelming artillery superiority went away, it's probably unsurprising that Russian infantry and tank forces haven't fared very well. This is somewhat expected from a military made up of mainly green and poorly trained conscripts, where most of the professional soldiers are more interested in lining their own pockets than defending a homeland. Most of Russia's actual territorial gains since the start of the invasion last year have been achieved by the Wagner Group, a huge private military contractor run by close Putin confidant Yevgeny Prigozhin. Unlike most of the Russian armed forces, the Wagner Group is well trained and equipped, allowing them to avoid some of the most basic pitfalls like walking into endless ambushes or fighting with no boots. One of the Wagner Group's most successful, yet horrible strategies has been the use of prisoners from Russian detention centers and jails, promising them freedom if they can survive a tour fighting in Ukraine. Leaked documents and phone calls suggest that Prigozhin and Putin never had any intention of letting most of these prisoners back into Russian society. Instead, tactics show that they have used them over and over again in the so-called human wave attacks, which helped Russia retake the devastated city of Bakhmut. Wagner released thousands of these armed prisoners who threw themselves against Ukrainian positions and risked being shot by other Russian troops if they retreated. When the Ukrainians opened their lines and revealed their primary defenses, Wagner's regular units would then begin direct assaults on the weakest points, often expending huge amounts of artillery. This strategy proved to be highly effective, especially for a military with such little emphasis on preserving the lives of its own troops. In Bakhmut and several other locations, Ukraine was eventually pushed back due to this strategy, which resembled Russia's actions during the huge sieges of World War II. But Wagner remains not just reliant on prisoners, but also on the continual influx of supplies from Russia's defense ministry. While the group has purchased a substantial amount of its own equipment over the years, inside Ukraine it has proved to be heavily reliant on Russian resupply to keep up the pressure on Ukraine. This has proved to be a significant weakness, and it could also mean the loss of Bakhmut and more valuable territory during the Ukrainian counteroffensive taking place this summer. Much of the issue has to do with the way that Russia, and Putin in particular, go about politics. One thing Hall has pointed out is that to keep his firm hold on power, Putin must ensure that none of his direct subordinates are too successful, or run the risk of being overthrown. To do so, he often sets elements of his own government against each other, with advisors and senior military planners competing, often viciously. This applies to Prigozhin too. The man, sometimes known as Putin's chef, experienced a meteoric rise to his current position. Despite private military contractors technically being against Russian law, Putin allowed Prigozhin to create Wagner, on the condition that the group be firmly loyal to Putin, not the Russian state. This formed the basis for Wagner's various interventions in Africa and the Middle East, where it expanded Putin's military reach, enriched Russian business interests, and left a trail of atrocities in its wake. Wagner's success launched Prigozhin into Putin's inner circle. This has not gone over well with other top Russian officials, such as Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu seems to believe that Prigozhin's ambitions and control over a private military are setting him up as the next head of the Russian military, or as Putin's personal successor. He may have reason to worry about his own job too, as Russia's military prowess under him has been less than stellar. Due to its enormous losses, the country is actually the #1 supplier of materiel to Ukraine, having abandoned roughly 500 since the start of its invasion. It has also lost advanced air defense systems and huge amounts of ammo. All this is a very bad look for Shoigu, and has led some to speculate about the reasons why Putin has dismissed multiple of his other top generals, but not Shoigu himself. One answer is that he has kept Shoigu in charge of the military because without Putin's support, Shoigu is a goner, and he knows it. Unlike the politically adept Prigozhin, Shoigu is an outsider to the corrupt ladder of Russian politics, having come up through the ranks from essentially nothing. Shoigu thus has few friends in Russia's top echelons and does not pose a real risk to Putin's power and control of the state. Ironically, his rise was also as a logistics officer, where he was able to skim or divert large amounts of money from defense projects. Some US military officials have even referred to him as responsible for dismantling much of Russia's capabilities. Prigozhin has also repeatedly attacked Shoigu for his failures in Ukraine, while at the same time pointing out that Wagner has achieved what he could not in places like Bakhmut. It would be easy for Putin to replace the somewhat unpopular Shoigu with Prigozhin, but doing so would potentially endanger Putin himself. Shoigu has also tried to push back from his position atop the Russian military command. He took credit for the capture of Soledar, a salt mining town which Wagner actually seems to have done most of the fighting for. Prigozhin actually took to social media to refute these claims and bash Shoigu, and just as Wagner was about to capture Bakhmut, it happened again. As Wagner troops were only miles from retaking the last of the town, Shoigu pulled their supplies just to hurt his rival. Now Russia's issues with supplies have compromised its entire war effort, and become a masterclass in how not to handle logistics. In response to Shoigu's actions in Bakhmut, Prigozhin took to social media once again, threatening to pull Wagner troops out of the area entirely, leaving the ineffective Russian military on its own. Obviously, this would have been a disaster and made Ukraine's counteroffensive that much easier. Shoigu, of course, claimed that he was not manipulating supply lines and that Wagner had actually received everything it had been promised. When Prigozhin took a stand and declared that he would pull out all Wagner troops from Bakhmut by May 10th, the supplies miraculously started flowing again, only to be reduced just days later. So is this just a petty personal struggle, or are Russia's supply issues really that bad? Well, it appears that things may actually be that disastrous, with personal rivalries like this being just one factor among many. While Russia's artillery and other heavy guns were firing almost non-stop last year, now they sit inactive for days at a time. This has allowed Ukrainian forces more opportunity to respond, and may be one reason why the counter-offensive began now. In Bakhmut, recent reports suggest that Ukraine is now advancing south of the city, along a salient about 4 miles deep, pushing Russian forces back. In part, this is possible thanks to the issues between Shoigu and Prigozhin, and due to the fact that Wagner has been doing the brunt of the fighting, while Russian troops secure its flanks. These flanking troops have been attempting to cut off the city for months, by capturing the main supply routes to Ukrainian positions. As Wagner closed in on the city and Ukrainian defenders were pushed back, the flank attacks have increased in frequency and intensity. Even as Wagner troops reportedly ran out of ammunition, it seemed as though Shoigu was content to let them take the losses, while using his troops to secure the area. Ukraine has not given up easily though. It reinforced defenders around Bakhmut with special forces, who managed to grind the spring Russian offensive to a halt. Since Wagner was unable to launch major attacks against Ukraine from the center, it has allowed Ukrainian forces to reinforce their flanks and launch the deadly counterattacks, which continue today. Prigozhin has once again complained about all this on social media, and his outbursts are nearly intense enough to constitute treason against the state. He has claimed that regular Russian forces broke and ran at the first hint of a Ukrainian attack, blaming Shoigu for the current situation. But from Ukrainian sources on the ground, it appears as though many of the troops cutting and running may actually be Wagner units. Such reports seem to have angered Prigozhin enough that he has actually lashed out at Putin online, in ways which could be very bad for his health. In a recent broadcast following more losses at Bakhmut, he stated that the happy grandfather thinks that he is good. If he turns out to be right, then God may grant everyone health. But what will the country do, our children, grandchildren, who are the future of Russia? And how can we win this war if, by chance, it turns out that this grandfather is a complete shithead? Putin is frequently referred to as Russia's grandfather, and Prigozhin seems to be directly attacking him in a way that no other Russian official has dared to do. Prigozhin quickly walked back his attack in later interviews, careful to state that many in Russian leadership could be called grandfather, but most likely the lashing out was a sign that Prigozhin is increasingly frustrated with the state of the war effort and blames Putin for the untenable situation. This is also likely to be one of the biggest issues Putin has yet faced, with his two top military leaders essentially sabotaging each other. The Russian offensive in Bakhmut has not been nearly as successful as it should have been. Just as Russia started to make headway against Ukraine, the supply issues and infighting may have doomed them once again. What's more, the actual prospect of victory in Bakhmut is essentially meaningless, as the city has never held any real strategic significance. Its only true value is political and ideological, as Putin sees Bakhmut as a symbol of his invasion's success, and losing it would undermine Russian support for the war effort. And Bakhmut is just one piece of the larger picture. This type of drama is playing out across the battle space in Ukraine, as different factions of the Russian military compete against each other for plunder and political influence. But we should remember that at least some of this insanity is by Putin's design, intended to make sure that no one faction can challenge him for dominance in Russia. And while hundreds of thousands of ordinary Russians have paid with their lives, the constant violence in Ukraine still seems far from the gilded halls of the Kremlin and Putin's vacation palaces. Even so, Putin knows that he has risked a lot in this conflict. As Hall points out, as to whether or not Putin will run out of something, willpower, ammunition, men, that he wants to send into the meat grinder, I would be surprised if Putin were to just say, okay, no, this is a big mistake, or I've gone too far, or we don't have enough resources. This is one of the significant problems with this, is where does Putin go from here? If he somehow gives up and surrenders, that's going to have negative implications for him back in Russia, but if he doesn't win, that will too, and it looks like he's not going to win. I'm glad I'm not in Vladimir Putin's position right now because he doesn't have a whole lot of space to work with. And in this latest stage of the war, Putin's troubles are increasing again. This time not even due to the incompetence of his own forces. The issue has to do with Ukraine's increasing access to long-range precision weaponry. Since the beginning of the conflict, Kyiv has been asking the West for more materiel, but they have been slow to materialize. It took months for the HIMARS missile system to be delivered, but once it was, Ukraine gained the ability to strike static targets several dozen miles away with deadly accuracy. And in the time since, the West seems to have become more receptive to handing over increasingly powerful weaponry. One of these is the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, capable of striking targets up to 190 miles away. If the US decides to give these or other similarly capable weapons to the Ukrainians, it will put many major Russian cities and military installations within striking distance. Similarly, the United Kingdom recently agreed to provide Kyiv with the Storm Shadow cruise missile. With sophisticated stealth capabilities and a range more than twice that of the HIMARS, the Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to hit targets far behind enemy lines as the counteroffensive ramps up. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace confirmed that some of these weapons are already in country, meaning we will likely start to see their effects soon. The UK has over 900 Storm Shadows in its arsenal, meaning that a sizable number will arrive this summer. While Ukraine's government has vowed not to strike into Russia itself, there are signs that it already is using drone attacks and border incursions. It is a simple reality that Ukraine cannot win the war without destroying at least the Russian bases resupplying the front, and this will almost certainly require strikes inside Russia proper. The same may hold true for F-16s and other advanced fighter jets. As Hall has stated, remember a few months ago when they said, "We're not going to send tanks," so that has shifted. Will this be another thing that shifts? Perhaps some of it will depend on what happens on the ground in the next year. A final element of the war's trajectory is the possibility of more external intervention, some of which might favor Russia. If Ukraine continues striking deeply into Russian territory, some experts have argued that China may soon get involved. Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping remain tacit allies, and China would not like the idea that a smaller neighbor supplied by the West could strike inside its borders. This and the CCP's affinity for fellow authoritarian regimes makes their position something of a question mark. As Hall notes, the Chinese position is really interesting and very complicated. The Chinese have very long-term goals. They want to be the primary superpower economically and militarily within the next 50 years. But by the same token, they share a certain ideology with Russia, and that is that democracies are a threat to them. So how is China going to play a neutral, moderating position in this when it's pretty clear they're coming down on Russia's side? Clearly that helps Russia, so China is walking a really fine tightrope at this point. However, there is also the possibility that China will attempt to stay in Ukraine's good graces in order to offer economic assistance rebuilding the country through loans and development projects. This is the strategy that Xi has taken with his massive Belt and Road project, and if applied to Ukraine, could generate substantial leverage over the West. Hall argues that if China wants a future, it's going to have really good economic relations with the West, the EU, the United States, and other developed countries. And a relationship with Russia is mutually exclusive, so if I'm Russia, I'm probably thinking that over the long term, the Chinese are not necessarily going to be on our side. All these considerations will play into how the war changes course in the months ahead. Russia's disorganization under Putin, Ukraine's increasing military assistance from the West, and the potential for more external involvement will all shape how effective the Ukrainian counteroffensive is this summer. They will also determine the long-term prospects for peace, as any potential peace treaty will not emerge until one side is definitively crippled, or forced to make concessions by its citizens or allied nations. When the dust finally settles, one thing is clear: Russia and Ukraine will both be changed forever, all due to the greed and ambition of one man, Vladimir Putin. So will Hall's prediction for the war pan out, or will there be another major deciding factor in how things go this summer and beyond? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. At this point in the Ukraine war, a drone attack could end Putin. Let us explain. May 30th, 2023 had all the ingredients to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day for Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he's been having a lot of those lately. Insulated from the horrors his regime have unleashed on Ukrainian civilians and soldiers fighting for their very existence just across the border, on that day 2 people were injured by a drone, which penetrated the airspace over Moscow and careened into a wealthy residential building. 2 weeks earlier, with air raid sirens wailing across the city, 2 similarly unarmed drones exploded over the Kremlin just 24 hours ahead of Russia's Victory Day celebrations. The Russians were quick to blame these strikes on Kyiv. An attack, they said, had been an assassination attempt on Putin himself. Yikes. As expected, Russian officials are trying to downplay these attacks, claiming they are insignificant and doing everything they can to lull the Russian public back into a false sense of safety and make sure they continue to support the war. But could there be more to these attacks than meets the eye? Could these drone strikes, along with the visible weakening of Putin's hold on power that has followed in their aftermath, really be the beginning of the end for Putin's regime? Let's find out. There isn't much we actually know about the drone attacks that hit Moscow. Reliable information, as you might expect, has been scant, and there's good reason for that. Putin's grip on Russian state censorship has grown tighter as his fortunes in Ukraine have flagged. Barring another Discord leak to enlighten us, what we can reliably assess comes from reading between the lines of Russian state media and combining that with the evidence from social media footage, open source intelligence, official statements, and eyewitness accounts. That said, here's what we know. On May 30th, there were 3 confirmed drone strikes in Russia. One hit a residential building on the outskirts of the city, a second struck a high-rise apartment block, while a third smashed into another high-rise building. Other footage emerged showing a drone against a bright blue sky streaking at low altitude over a wealthy Moscow suburb. Not all 8 drones which were fired at Moscow hit their targets. 5 were intercepted by Russian Pantsir air defense batteries, which, fortunately for the residents, had been installed earlier this year. Soft kill systems, which target a drone's delicate sensors, communication arrays, and guidance and electronic systems, were also employed and reportedly downed about 3 more. It was not immediately clear who was responsible for these. The first successful drone assaults on the Russian capital since the start of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Security camera or eyewitness footage is often the best bet for drone experts to identify their provenance. Footage from these attacks, however, seemed to beg more questions than clarify them. One drone's in-air outline was clearly visible in one of the videos which surfaced online. Perplexingly, it was not remotely the same as the UJ-22 drone in widespread Ukrainian service, some of which were reported to have been used in the attack. Unlike the UJ-22, which employs a traditional front-mount propeller, the drone which left experts scratching their heads had canards and pusher propellers that made it resemble something more akin to a hammerhead shark than anything we'd really seen before. This unique design suggested that the drones in question could have been a type of kamikaze drone known as the Beaver, recently reported on in Ukraine. The Beaver is a drone project initiated by a Ukrainian blogger who created 5 prototypes using crowdsourced money for the Ukrainian armed forces. His drone does bear the same forward canard wing configuration as the video, but the outline was still not a perfect match. Other experts claim the attacks were made by modernized A-2 Sinitsa drones, resembling an Israeli-made IAI Harop barrage munition, which can allegedly fly up to 1,000 kilometers. It would have to be heavily modified. The A-2 Sinitsa itself can only fly for around an hour, meaning it would have to be launched virtually from within Moscow itself. What we can't learn from the drone's shape, we can try to discern from its scale. According to one American drone expert, the size of the drones, including those used to strike the Kremlin in early May, showed they could fly tens of kilometers, if not hundreds. This would seem to confirm military involvement in their conception. In other words, that they came from across the border in Ukraine, fired by someone associated with the Ukrainian armed forces. But not necessarily. These May attacks were far from the only drone strikes since the start of the calendar year. There have been more than 60 such strikes over the past 6 months, most of them on military depots and air bases in the neighboring Crimean, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions. Further inland, there have also been a series of drone strikes against air bases in the Ryazan, Saratov, and Kursk regions. Multiple drone attacks have been filmed on Russian ships moored in the Black Sea, as well as reports of attacks on Russian pipelines and oil refineries near Novorossiysk, one of Russia's biggest oil export hubs. All of these were military or military-adjacent targets which could directly be categorized as things sustaining or helping facilitate Russia's ongoing war effort. The attacks on Moscow were clearly different. Unlike the attacks in the military sphere, these drones, which struck civilian targets, caused minor damage because all but one had been stripped of their warheads. According to 2 Russian experts, rather than inflict heavy collateral damage, The attacks were meant to send a message that Ukraine, which has not claimed responsibility for the strikes, has both the capacity and will to strike back at the capital of its enemy invader. Though it would enable Russian air defenses to more easily track their flight trajectory, piloting the drones in broad daylight was therefore a conscious decision, even if Ukraine refrained from applying deadly force, something it easily could have justified in honest retaliation for the pain and suffering the Kremlin has inflicted. Kyiv wanted Russian residents to know they were being attacked in broad daylight, when people were awake, and when it would be harder for Russian state media to deny the scope of these attacks. It is part of an ongoing, gradually escalatory psychological campaign against Russian President Vladimir Putin's regime. Where they hit was also not a mistake. The wealthy suburbs of Moscow are home to the families of prominent oligarchs and political elites, Russia's civilian upper crust. These are the key pillars of support for Putin's regime. One US official and a congressional staffer mentioned that the attacks could have been aimed at what were believed to be the Moscow residencies of Russian intelligence officers. Intelligence officials at Strider Technologies, a Utah-based strategic intelligence startup, for example, have been able to establish a connection between one of the buildings and the Russian SVR, or Foreign Intelligence Service. The building, they claimed, was owned by a Russian state budgetary organization, which has held contracts with a military unit known to be a cover for the Foreign Intelligence Service. Strider Technologies' chief operating officer, Eric Levesque, dismissed the possibility that this was a random attack on a haphazardly chosen civilian target. The strikes get to the heart of the psychological warfare elements of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, he said, which for the first time is reaching Moscow neighborhoods. The attacks, therefore, were meant to sow doubt and discord among Putin's followers at a critical time. And in retrospect, the attack seemed incredibly well-timed. We know the domestic situation in Russia is in dire straits, as major new developments like Prigozhin's aborted mercenary march on Moscow and aborted mutiny attest, Putin may have thus far been able to retain his domestic stranglehold on power, but new challenges are collectively revealing the extent of his control. It is a grip that is slowly weakening. If the attacks were in fact staged by Kyiv, and it is extremely likely that they were, they have been extremely smart to keep their role in staging them relatively anonymous. President Zelensky has billions of reasons to maintain his close friendships with the Western powers, which have thus far helped undergird Ukraine's war effort. Fearing the escalatory crisis that might rear its ugly head from an outright attack on Russian soil using Western-donated weapons, the Biden administration in particular has counseled Zelensky and his military advisors to refrain from using American-donated weapons on sabotage missions within Russia itself. Biden's staff is far from alone. Using homemade, crowdsourced drones may have been Kyiv's way of circumventing these fears. No matter what, they will doggedly deny all responsibility or involvement in the attacks. Behind the scenes, however, Ukraine is almost obligated to engage in this type of full-spectrum warfare, especially now as the outcome of its counteroffensive hangs in the balance. Any degree of chaos and instability it can engender in Russia, especially among its political and military elite who are controlling the war, will reverberate favorably as they refocus on the bloody task at hand, retaking lost territory. With far more intelligence on what is going on inside Russia than we can ever hope to have, Ukrainian officials may have read the tea leaves weeks in advance, dating back to the Battle of Bakhmut, that Prigozhin was unstable and that his relationship with Putin was on very thin ice. But more likely than not, Ukraine will not have put all its eggs into one basket. While the Wagner mutiny and the drone attacks before it were a pleasant distraction, the Ukrainians remain wholly focused on the task at hand. One American, Ryan O'Leary, currently serving as a junior sergeant in the Ukrainian military, remarked that he and his men found the drone attacks and subsequent revolt glorious, and that even though it did not lead to the fracture of Putin's cabinet, the momentary seizure of Rostov-on-Don, the epicenter of Russia's resupply, air and command capabilities in the southern region, will cause a welcome level of disorder in the weeks to come, as Russia struggles to bring supplies to bolster its front lines, and its officers have to suss out the allegiance of the Wagner fighters now under the military's command. More problems, O'Leary commented, would occur latently. It's just a matter of where and how long it takes to kick in. This may have been an observation based primarily on the recent Wagner coup attempt, but it certainly carries over in its application to the May drone attacks. Their impact, according to O'Leary's line of thinking, will not be visibly apparent until well down the road, when their political, economic, psychological aftermath has been allowed to play out. Like the Wagner insurrection, the drone attacks demonstrably illustrated Putin's weakness. Retired General Kenneth McKenzie, one-time leader of US Central Command, observed that after the Wagner March, Putin was weaker today than he was 72 hours ago, because the key to Putin's survival is absolute relentless control. That myth, he continued, has been punctured, and you have that disarray at the top, which I think makes him weak, vulnerable, and I would add, even more dangerous. How then did the drone attacks like the Wagner mutiny chip away at Putin's meticulously built illusion of control? It's no secret by now that Russia does a lot of things poorly. The recent Wagner episode may have illustrated that Russia, once purportedly the second best military in the world, now clearly the second best military in Ukraine, may in fact even be the second best military in its own country. Jokes aside, Russia had always approached air defense with all the commitment and zeal its Cold War coffers could muster, readying itself for an inevitable showdown with a NATO rival who, it felt, would possess air superiority in the event of a direct confrontation. Russia felt it had to invest heavily in its own ground-based air defenses. And invest in it they did. By the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it was once safely assumed that Russia's homeland air defense capabilities were among the best in the world, boasting a layered system of long-range S-200, S-300, and S-400 systems, which have an air defense radius of 800 kilometers, medium-range 9K-37 Buck systems and its many variants which increase radar coverage within its air defense zone and bolster the relatively sparse number of longer-range interceptor missiles. And then you have the short-range mobile systems like the 9K-33 OSA and S-125 Nival, which can directly cover key installations like military bases, airfields, and other locations. The first and second tier systems are protected by Pantsir S-1 and Tor systems, which protect more expensive long-range interceptors from the hypersonic and cruise missile threats they are most vulnerable to. Or at least they are supposed to. If the drone attacks were in fact launched from Ukraine in broad daylight, these relatively slow-flying drones would have been spotted by Russia's air defenses even at low altitudes, and therefore should have been downed well before they reached their destination. But several of them weren't. In a move that would have made British parliamentarian Stanley Baldwin proud, who boldly but inaccurately proclaimed in 1932 that the bomber will always get through, those little drones flew and kept on flying right past Russia's Pantsir air defenses until they smashed right into a residential high-rise. Intended or not, where does that leave us? Well, basically we now know that while Ukraine has proven that it can pretty safely protect its major cities from 90% of Russia's air attacks, using things like the American-donated Patriot air defense system, which notably not too long ago downed a Russian hypersonic Kinzhal missile, an impressive and astonishing achievement, Russia has proven that it is not only unable to maintain its mobile air defense systems in Ukraine, which Ukraine has systematically destroyed in such a manner as to leave its government increasingly incapable of replacing them, but that it can also barely protect its own military airfields, command nodes, supply hubs, and capital alike. It's not easy to tell what is going wrong or even what is going on in Russia. Common sense tells us that the drones should have been launched from within Russian territory, so that they could have avoided targeting by Russian air defenses until the last minute. But here we are in 2023, and Russia has demonstrated its incompetence with protecting and using its modernized air defense systems, going back to the sinking of its flagship, the Moskva, a ship sunk by two aging anti-ship missiles of the type it was expressly designed to protect the entire Black Sea Fleet from. It has been speculated that the Moskva's crew did not have its air defense radars powered up in that episode, leaving it critically vulnerable to the strike that instantly made a pricey ship an artificial reef. There are other reports that Russian crews often leave off defense radars in a way that makes exposed groups into juicy targets for Bayraktar drones. Add to this the verifiable evidence that safety pins were in place on mobile air defense systems after capture, something which would have prevented their radars from working in the first place. Could Russia's air defense crews truly be this bad at their job? Perhaps at the start of the war, sure, but now, today, Russia hasn't done much to dispel our doubts. Recently, it left its borders so insecure that anti-Putin Russian partisan groups were able to stage a 2-day cross-border raid which captured a border checkpoint and overran several settlements in Russia's Belgorod region. The leader of the Freedom of Russia Legion, one of these groups, has recently told Western journalists that his fighters were afraid of nothing, and no one can stop them from seizing power and finishing off Putin. "We are gathering strength and getting ready," he said. "It's just a question of time before our banner is flying above the Kremlin." Yes, the problems are mounting in Russia itself. Ukraine has done a masterful job seizing the moral high ground in the war thus far. It could have easily used explosive suicide drones in the May attacks, but that does not really fit Ukraine's MO thus far. For one, attacking civilians with kamikaze drones is a war crime. Putin may not register a modicum of regret for authorizing such attacks, but Ukraine cannot afford to. It needs the moral high ground to continue retaining its support from the West. There is a deep and abiding frustration in the halls of power both within and without Ukraine that holds that if Russia gets to fight dirty, Ukraine should too. But Ukraine has loftier ambitions. It hopes one day to even join the EU and NATO. To do this, it must continue to abide by the Western expectations that it's waging a just war, which it has heretofore done. Launching a drone attack on an affluent Moscow neighborhood may just have been Ukraine's way of blurring the clearly demarcated lines in the sand. It was designed to rattle cages, to cause regular Russians to feel that sense of deep-seated fear that they have not been accustomed to. In some respects, the attacks had the opposite effect. In the aftermath of one of the drone strikes on the wealthy suburb, many regular Russians actually celebrated the strike. The wealthy elites, many claimed, the one tier of society untouched by war, deserved to be targeted. The celebrations gained so much traction that certain Russian military bloggers, sycophantic to the Kremlin clearly, began to issue appeals for all Russians to unite. Predictably, Russian propagandists and television presenters played up the nature of the attacks, likening them to terrorist attacks akin to those which rocked Russia in the late 90s and early 2000s, and searching for scapegoats, enemies of the state and foreign agents who may have been involved. What is clear is that the attacks fit a broader pattern of destabilizing operations being conducted within Russia itself, designed to reveal potentially deadly fissures in the country's civil military apparatus. The May 3rd drone attacks were only the start. The invasion of the Belgorod region and the broader threat posed by the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps have brought war home to average Russians, as the soldiers defending them are taken prisoner, their settlements are shelled, and their territory is momentarily occupied. In these attacks, footage emerges of a mass exodus of prisoners. Official Russian media pretends everything is normal, but underlying it all is the painfully present reminder that Russia is increasingly unable to keep its own civilians safe, that Putin is failing at his job. Add to that the desperate scenes of the Wagner mutiny, attack helicopters and aircraft being shot out of the sky, entire command centers being captured in a matter of hours, huge convoys marching on Moscow, sand barriers, holes, and overturned trucks littering the road in an attempt to slow their advance, military vehicles in the streets of Moscow preparing for imminent war, a warning from the mayor of Moscow to take Monday off. Things could, after all, get nasty. But that is the history of Russia. Its leaders overreach, it becomes overconfident, and in the end it is unable to protect itself from the very situation it created. The drone attacks undoubtedly raise questions about Moscow's air defense capabilities. Some experts claim that even though the majority of the drones were shot down, the fact that a few got through indicated to Kyiv that Moscow was vulnerable to air attack, that a percentage could get past their air defenses. Like other, more damaging attacks on vulnerable depots, supply nodes, and other targets, these are symbolic attacks. They are meant to strike the Russian psyche, the unfounded air of invincibility they themselves have drawn over their own people. For long, they have felt they were untouchable. No longer. Polls are starting to reveal that one of the main topics of conversation within Russia is the war, something that 9 months ago few cared to discuss. Like it did with everything else, the Kremlin tried to downplay the attacks. If they continue, however, will the Kremlin be able to convince the population that this is the new norm? War is now at Russia's doorstep. The jury is still out whether or not it can actually defend itself. But what do you think? Is this drone incident the beginning of the end for Putin? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. As of June 2023, Russian tank losses have exceeded a whopping 4,000 since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. That is a lot of tanks, and Putin's troubles don't end there. Russia will have a manpower shortage very soon unless Putin orders another wave of mobilization. But Ukrainian losses have not been insignificant either. So far, Ukraine has managed to constantly mobilize their soldiers and replace their losses. But how long before they start running out of manpower too? Will Putin run out of troops before Ukraine does? Let's hear what our military experts have to say. In February 2023, word got out that a treasure trove of classified US documents had been leaked across the popular social media platform Discord. In those documents were some harsh assessments of the future of Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia, who had begun their full-fledged invasion a year earlier in February 2022. The more than 100 documents included secret and top-secret files on foreign intelligence, analysis of opponent forces, and briefing documents for US military and government officials. One file in particular stood out. In its pages, the source claimed that Ukraine would be faced with significant force generation and sustainment shortfalls, and the probability that any Ukrainian offensive in 2023 would result in only modest territorial gains if not supported by a sufficient number of troops and hardware. This report was not the first time Ukraine was challenged on whether they had enough men to defeat the vastly larger country of Russia. It's been evident for some time that both Ukraine and Russia have seen a decline in their populations. For Ukraine, the 2014 invasion of the Donbas region and Crimea initiated their population decline. Their population loss has significantly increased since the February 2022 invasion, coupled with the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and brutalization of any population that didn't evacuate. Russia, despite having a vastly bigger population, has a vastly different problem. It's huge, aka hugely embarrassing losses of hardware. Russia's hardware problems in comparison to its troop losses are perhaps a more reliable indicator of just how bad the war has been going for them, since tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, trucks and artillery are big and bulky. Their losses are harder to hide and can be counted and identified more easily than individual soldiers. When analysts look at hardware losses Russia has suffered, the numbers are simply staggering. An analysis done by the Ukrainian General Staff reports that Russian armed forces have lost over 3,900 tanks, 7,600 armored fighting vehicles, 6,400 unarmored vehicles and fuel tanks, 3,700 artillery systems, 600 multiple rocket launch systems (MLRS), 350 air defense systems, more than 300 planes, 300 helicopters, 3,200 drones, and 18 ships. To put this all into perspective, Russia was believed to have only around 3,500 main battle tanks before the invasion. The best estimates were that they invaded Ukraine with a total ground force of around 150,000 soldiers. An update on June 21, 2023 from the same Ukrainian source suggested that the number of lost Russian tanks has just exceeded 4,000. While the estimate from Ukraine might be biased, those from neutral open source group Oryx are not. They count only those weapon systems for which they can prove beyond a shadow of doubt that they were destroyed or captured, and document each and every loss in their figures. They report as of June 13, 2023, Russia has lost at a minimum 2,070 tanks, 894 armored fighting vehicles, 2,454 infantry fighting vehicles, 318 armored personnel carriers, and thousands more mine-resistant vehicles, transports, mobile artillery, air defense systems, and various intelligence, supply, and command vehicles. Since Oryx only includes confirmed losses, even they admit Russia's real losses are much higher. There are several indications of how bad Russian material losses are. One of the most glaring is that Russia has been transporting 70- and 80-year-old tanks from storage yards and even museums and sending them by rail to the front. One such relic was a T-54-55 that was packed with around 6 tons of explosives and sent trundling to the Ukrainian front lines, though it was blown up before it could reach them. That tank was built a few years after the end of World War II. Others just like it have been photographed heading towards the front lines from all over Russia. Another surprising display occurred during the 2023 May Day parade through Red Square in Moscow. Normally, this was the yearly event when the supposedly mighty Russian military would parade its newest and most powerful military vehicles, from tanks, IFVs, and multiple launch rocket systems to portable ballistic missiles, all of them overflown by frontline fighters and strategic bombers. But this year, the world received a surprise, when only a single World War II-era T-34 tank trundled through the parade. President Vladimir Putin was mocked around the world for such a weak display of supposed Russian military might. So it's pretty clear at this point that Russia is indeed running out of tanks, but does it have enough troops to defend its own cities? Even more embarrassing for Putin was the abortive March for Justice that his one-time chef and military oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin launched for a brief 24-hour period from June 23rd through 24th. Prigozhin's private military company, the Wagner Group, was able to capture the major city of Rostov-on-Don without firing a shot, and weren't met with any substantial ground opposition until they were within 125 miles of Moscow itself. The only thing that apparently stopped Prigozhin and Wagner was the failure of a popular uprising to join him. He certainly wasn't stopped by any military units. Most analysts believe that's because the vast majority of Russian military strength is all in Ukraine. Additional shortages of men and material have been seen in the Russian oblast of Belgorod, where a series of cross-border raids launched by Free Russian opposition units, together with a small number of Polish expatriates fighting for Ukraine, have caused havoc for weeks. The minimal border security forces there have been wholly incapable of stopping them, not until they were supported by heavy artillery and air force strikes. Some reports say that the Russian defense units didn't even have weapons or ammo, since according to Russian law it was illegal for them to carry firearms. What about the regular troops? Now that we've seen that Russia has suffered a probably massive loss in hardware and material, and doesn't even have enough troops to protect its own borders, we can better understand the level of their actual troop losses and possible remaining strength. According to the same Ukrainian General Staff report mentioned earlier, Russia has lost a staggering 213,000 killed, wounded and missing soldiers, sailors and airmen. That analysis includes more than 43,000 killed in action and over 170,000 wounded, many of whom will not be returning to combat. The Independent Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, has come up with an even higher estimate. Their report from February 2023 indicated that Russia had lost as many as 250,000 total casualties. In comparison, this total from just the 12 months of fighting is more than all the combat losses Russia and the former Soviet Union had suffered in all their wars since World War II combined. The estimate of 250,000 casualties would have increased by an additional 60,000 to 70,000 casualties between February and June of 2023. In just the first 3 months of the invasion, Russia suffered as many casualties as it did during its entire 10-year war in Afghanistan. What's worse is that according to the most recent reports, their casualty rate may be increasing. Russia lost over 1,100 troops in a single day on June 8th, as Ukraine has begun to hammer Russian forces with its summer offensive. But what's causing such high casualty rates? One of the biggest causes of such casualties is the outdated method in which Russia is conducting the war. Overall, the Russian military doctrine has changed little since World War I. They rely on masses of inaccurate artillery supported by fighters that perform ground attack roles and masses of human assaults, sometimes but not always, backed up by tanks. But the Russian Air Force, known as the SVS, has seen high losses as well, due to the large numbers of surface-to-air missiles sent by the US and NATO members. They've been reluctant to fly over Ukrainian territory and prefer to lob bombs from the safety of Russian-occupied territory. Russian doctrine also suggests that if the first human assault fails, keep sending in more troops until the defenders fold. Britain's Defense Intelligence Agency points out that such outdated tactics carry with them enormous losses. Their report states that a combination of poor low-level tactics, limited air cover, a lack of flexibility and a command approach which is prepared to reinforce failure and repeat mistakes has led to Russia's high casualty rate among its troops in Ukraine. But here's the really bad part. These casualties primarily include the vets and the elite. Indeed, one of the most significant areas where Russia's casualties have had a telling effect has been in their elite units. An example of the losses such elite units have suffered can be seen in the current state of the 331st Guards Airborne Regiment, a part of the 98th Guards Airborne Division, one of the best trained and most experienced combat units Russia has available. Prior to the invasion, the 331st Regiment's size was around 1,500 to 1,700 soldiers. It sent 2 battalion groups into Ukraine at the start of the invasion on February 24, 2022, for a total of 1,000 to 1,200 men. They suffered heavily in the initial day's effort to capture Hostomel Airport, just outside of Kyiv. The lightly armored infantry vehicles that they were sent in with proved no match for Ukrainian anti-tank weapons and heavy artillery. An estimated 94 soldiers, almost 10% of their strength, were killed in just the first few days of fighting. By the end of the year, some accounts indicated their casualties numbered more than 500. Continued fighting showed that the unit was unprepared for the length of the war. Within just a few weeks of the invasion, locals back at the city of Kostroma, where the unit was based, were holding fundraising drives to send the troops warm clothes. The governor of the region, Sergei Sitnikov, a former CO of the 331st, commented a few months later that we need to help our guys so they have decent conditions. When he visited the wounded survivors, he brought with him care packages from relatives back home and civilian drones bought on the open market. If the conditions were this bad for one of Russia's most elite units, then it can only be much worse for the regular army troops. These same high casualty rates have been reported for all branches of Russia's armed forces. But since the best trained, most elite units are the ones that can be most trusted in a fight, those are the ones that can see the most intense combat, often spearheading assaults in battles around Mariupol, Bakhmut, and as we've seen with the 331st, the initial drives on Kyiv. The problem is, as Russia loses a significant portion of their combat veterans, they're being replaced with less well-trained and less skilled replacements. For a while, the Russian regular troops were supplemented by Prigozhin's Wagner forces, widely regarded as some of the most experienced urban fighters Russia had left. But Prigozhin's abortive march on Moscow resulted in him being exiled to Belarus, and his Wagner troops being split up between joining him in Belarus, signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense, or returning home to Russia. The Wagner forces had been responsible for the only sector where Russia had made any kind of incremental gains since the opening months of the invasion, that being around the area of the eastern city of Bakhmut. According to the US National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, who spoke to reporters on May 1, 2023, Russia had lost nearly 100,000 casualties in its 10-month siege of Bakhmut, including about 20,000 soldiers killed in combat and 80,000 wounded. Ukraine have lost about 1/5 as many in its defense of the city, according to US intelligence estimates, or around 4,000 killed and up to 15,000 wounded. It was clear that within the first few months of the invasion that Russia had failed to allocate enough forces for the complete subjugation of Ukraine, and had vastly underestimated the number of casualties they would suffer. In September 2022, Putin announced a mobilization of 120,000 new troops, while a law was also passed making it a crime for anyone in Russia to call the invasion a war. Those 120,000 weren't enough, however, and further conscriptions raised the total to around 300,000 by the end of 2022. These nationwide call-ups have had a serious negative side effect. On top of losing 250,000 men as casualties of war, as many as 1 million additional young men and women have fled Russia to avoid the conscription. Many of those who left are the young professionals that Russia desperately needs and cannot replace. These emigres have left for various reasons, but their primary reason was to escape the mobilization, along with fleeing the Western sanctions that have caused enormous economic distress within the nation. This has led to a significant manpower shortage across Russia. In an intelligence update released on May 27, 2023, the British Defense Ministry observed that a survey conducted by the Russian Central Bank involving 14,000 employees had determined that Russia's national labor force was at its lowest recorded level since 1998. In addition to losses from the war and emigration to avoid the draft, the survey also showed that the Russian population had previously decreased by up to 2 million in the years between 2020 and 2022, due to several factors, including the poor Russian response to the COVID pandemic, poor healthcare and diet, excessive alcoholism, and an increasingly aging population. Nowhere has this lack of workers been more acutely felt than in the tech sector, where shortages of trained workers have hit the electronics and programming sectors hard. This brain drain, along with continuing Western sanctions, has caused what Laura Solanko, a senior advisor for the Bank of Finland, described as reverse industrialization. This means Russia has not only seen a shrinking of its economy, but has had to replace overseas investment, lost due to Western sanctions, with funds supplied by the state. Solanko reported such policies can only succeed with huge investments in domestic production to replace lost imports, as well as the construction of new transportation links to the east and south. As resources are limited, she continued, this implies less investment in other sectors, including potentially more productive areas. Russia's investments will continue to move away from the technological frontier, she said, which is why she considers Russia's current state of the economy as reverse industrialization. These factors combine to indicate that Russia will have increasingly fewer young men and women for Putin to draft in 2023, if he feels the need to repeat his previous mistake. On top of Russia's potentially catastrophic combat losses and manpower shortages, Russia is also facing another area of concern: the loss of their combat leadership. One of the most widely reported problems regarding the Russian army is a distinct lack of unity of command. Part of that problem is currently due to the combat losses which extend up the chain of command. As of November 2022, Russia had lost more than 1,500 officers in the first 9 months of the war, according to estimates by Ukrainian Colonel Anatoly Stefan, and backed up by studies done by the US Center for Naval Analysis. These reports suggest an estimated 160 of those 1,500 lost officers were generals, major generals, and lieutenant generals, as well as more than 150 colonels and lieutenant colonels, 250 majors, 296 captains, and nearly 500 senior lieutenants, in descending order of rank. While confirmed numbers, as with the lost Russian hardware, suggest a much lower number is more likely, it's clear that whatever the actual total is, Russia is losing far more officers of higher ranks than most Western armies would under similar battlefield conditions. As noted previously, one of the few areas where Russian military has been successful is with its private military companies, like Wagner. But there have been highly publicized clashes between Prigozhin, Wagner's leader, and the Russian military leadership in Moscow. Prigozhin has complained on multiple occasions that his private military group's needs have not been met. Meanwhile, whenever a high-ranking officer from the regular Russian army was fired, Prigozhin has been hiring them and adding them to his own private army, further distancing himself from Moscow. Prigozhin's march on Moscow was responsible for another loss for Russia. General Sergei Surovikin, the deputy commander of the Russian group of forces fighting in Ukraine, disappeared from public sight following the march and was rumored to be under arrest for knowing about Prigozhin's plan and not informing Putin. Surovikin's disappearance will be keenly felt across the entirety of the Russian military, as he was one of the most reliable ground commanders in the army, having attained his rank through skill and accomplishments, unlike those above him in the Russian chain of command who owed their position due to loyalty to Putin above all else. We've seen the many problems Russia is having with its troop losses and its population decline. How well is Ukraine doing in filling out its army? Ukraine has exceeded all expectations in lasting more than a year against a country nearly 30 times its size in area, 17 million square kilometers versus 603,000 square kilometers, and more than triple its size in population, 143 million versus 43 million for Ukraine. That widely accepted estimate of the Ukrainian population of roughly 43 million is contradicted by other sources. According to statistics compiled by England's The Economist newspaper, Ukraine, including Crimea and the Donbass, has lost about 16% of its population between its independence in 1991 from the former Soviet Union and the eve of the 2022 Russian invasion. These numbers suggest that Ukraine now has a population of only about 36 million, compared to around 52 million in 1991. But that's to be expected in a country where the invader, Russia, has indiscriminately attacked civilian population centers and has leveled whole cities, like Mariupol, which has seen its pre-war population of 400,000 reduced to less than 5,000. This same Russian effort to depopulate any area of resistance has been repeated across whole regions of Ukraine. According to the Joint Research Center of the European Economic Union, the EU, Ukraine will continue to see a steady decline in its population over the next 20 to 30 years, even under the most optimistic of circumstances. The JRC has estimated that by the beginning of February 2023, around 5.3 million Ukrainian civilians had been displaced internally across Ukraine, while approximately 7 million had emigrated to other countries, with around 4 million of those fleeing to nearby EU countries, especially Poland. This means that the invasion has displaced close to 30% of the entire Ukrainian population, both inside and outside of Ukraine. That accounts for the disparity between the pre-war estimates of 43 million for the Ukrainian population and the more recent 35 to 36 million figure. It would seem then that Ukraine could be facing a shortfall of the younger demographic that usually makes up military service recruits. However, those numbers belie the reality that an overwhelming number of volunteers have flooded the Ukrainian army, more than they can adequately train and supply. Since the beginning of the invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has seen a truly heroic response not just from within its own borders, but from abroad as well. An estimated 2,000 to 3,000 foreign fighters are believed to be serving in 3 battalions of a Ukrainian unit named the International Legion, according to analysts and academics monitoring them. But because the Ukrainian government wishes to keep such numbers private, these numbers are only best guess estimates. In the early months of the war, Ukrainian officials estimated that as many as 20,000 volunteers from more than 50 countries had arrived to help fight against the Russian invasion. But according to analysts and interviews with many of the foreign fighters who stayed, the vast majority appear to have returned home before the summer. Hundreds of the better-trained volunteers have since then been integrated into smaller units that operate independently of the International Legion. These groups, led by long-time regional opponents of Moscow such as the Georgian Legion and Chechen battalions, as well as other primarily Western units with names like Alpha, Phalanx, and the Norman Brigade. Some of the volunteers who stayed are being used to train young Ukrainian recruits, though their training is often rudimentary. Where a Western nation like the US would spend up to 10 weeks of training in boot camp, the Ukrainian recruits often get as little as 3 to 5 days, though most will get around 2 to 3 weeks. It's not just the total number of troops that Ukraine has that should be considered, but also the troops who are trained well enough to survive the most dangerous first few weeks of their deployment. It's also clear that the numbers of Ukrainian men and women who volunteered were more than the Ukrainian army could train early in the war. More than 140,000 Ukrainians, mostly men, have returned from Europe, according to a social media post by Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov from March 2022. Tens of thousands joined the Territorial Defense Forces. According to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, between 9 and 12 new assault brigades totaling 40,000 men have been training for months to help spearhead the current counteroffensive. Their numbers were swelled by countrywide media campaigns that called on young Ukrainians, both men and women, to join up to help rid their country of the Russian invaders. One of the leaked assessment documents from February 2023, titled Russia-Ukraine Assessed Combat Sustainability and Attrition, compiled by the US Defense Intelligence Agency, suggested that Ukraine had suffered as many as 130,000 total casualties, including 17,000 killed in action and another 113,000 wounded. Ukraine has been very tight-lipped about their own casualty figures, so these numbers are merely best guess estimates. Overall, it can be seen that Ukraine does have less population from which to draw its military recruits, while sustaining very large losses over the first year of the war. Offsetting this has been a continued strong volunteer effort from both inside and outside Ukraine. The violence that Russia has unleashed on the Ukrainian civilians has convinced many in Ukraine, who would normally let others do the fighting, to step up and join their country in defending against the Russian invaders. No matter how long this war goes on, whether for months or years, it doesn't appear that Ukraine will run out of highly motivated volunteers anytime soon. The original question, will Russia run out of troops before Ukraine does, seemed at first to be an easily answered question. With 3 times the population, it would have appeared that Russia would simply be able to wear down Ukraine over years of relentless, grinding warfare. But the reality is, Russia's military is on the brink of collapse. Their best units have been shattered, and their ranks have been filled with ill-trained, poorly supplied, and poorly led conscripts. Their once vaunted dominance in tanks is now just a memory, and their artillery is being outfought and outshot by more accurate and longer-range systems supplied by the West. Russia's air force can't gain air superiority over the battlefield, while Russia's economy is so drastically damaged that they simply cannot replace the losses they've suffered in high-tech weapons. Ukraine appears motivated enough and well enough equipped that, if the war were to last another year or another 10, they'd never run out of people willing to fight to remove the last Russian occupier from their land. But what do you think? How close is Putin to completely running out of soldiers? Will Ukraine continue to be successful in replacing their short-term manpower deficit? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. While we've said it before, we'll say it again. Vladimir Putin is in trouble, and it's worse than you think. The man who has ruled Russia with an iron fist for more than 20 years finally jeopardized his own future when he invaded Ukraine last spring. That decision has led to a string of remarkable defeats and failures, which has exposed cracks in Putin's rule for the first time in decades. Now, a year and a half later, they are presenting enormous challenges that he might not be able to crush with force. From the outside, Putin's continued belligerence towards Ukraine and the West is puzzling, since it has left him in a far worse spot geopolitically than he was at the start of 2022. But as William Shakespeare once wrote, "Uneasy wears the head that lies the crown." Putin has been uneasy in his seat of power for many, many years. This insecurity has driven him to obsession and helped him turn into the ruthless, corrupt, and jingoistic dictator we see today, one who silences any dissent inside his country, has journalists and defectors abroad murdered in broad daylight, and even faced a brief rebellion from his own confidants earlier this year. He can't even admit that this is a war, violently suppressing anyone who doesn't refer to it as a special military operation. But all these mistakes and tactics have also exposed the cracks in Putin's rule. His miscalculations about Ukraine and his ability to succeed there have left him weak, isolated, and flailing. He faces simmering tensions at home, an exodus of young and talented individuals from Russia, and a conscript army seemingly incapable of attacking or defending well enough to win any real victories. And despite its slow pace, Putin now also faces a Ukrainian counteroffensive which may retake even the small parts of the country which Putin has been able to hold on to. While it's unclear how successful the effort will prove to be, The counteroffensive seems to be developing along three axes which could seriously challenge Putin's capabilities. One is the southern Zaporizhia Oblast, one to the east in the Donetsk Oblast, and the other around the destroyed northern city of Bakhmut. Ukraine also continues to launch cross-border raids into Russia's territory near the city of Belgorod, where Russian military bloggers have claimed that entire regiments have been wiped out. From all these sources and more, it's clear that Putin faces numerous challenges to his future and possibly his life. It's also clear that he cannot afford to admit that he's screwed up, as his efforts to crush dissent and keep the Russian people on his side have been intense. And yet even Putin has had to admit in recent weeks that the war he and his yes-men launched is going poorly. Ukraine's counteroffensive, which some have claimed is going poorly, has still been effective enough that Putin admitted on June 9, 2023 that, "In recent days we have seen significant losses in Ukraine." While this is clearly understating things quite a bit, it's also among the very first times Putin has been forced to acknowledge his problems at all. From a brutal dictator, this is about as close as it gets to a mea culpa. And things don't look to be getting much better. Despite taking heavy losses in their initial assaults of Russian positions, Ukraine's armed forces have made significant progress in breaking through fortified defensive lines in the country's southeast. Specifically, the most notable gains have been south of the Dnipro River, which divides the half-liberated city of Kherson. Russian military bloggers reported that up to 7 boats, each carrying 6 to 7 people, had landed near the village of Kazachi Laheri, east of Kherson city, on Tuesday, and broke through Russian defensive lines. It was claimed that the Ukrainian soldiers had advanced up to 800 meters after getting to the riverbank, though it appeared Russian forces had some success in fighting them back. The Russian-imposed head of the occupied part of the Kherson Oblast, Vladimir Saldo, claimed the Ukrainian raid had been repelled. However, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, a think tank in Washington which closely tracks the conflict, said that it appeared that the limited raid may have had more success than Saldo had acknowledged. ISW wrote in a recent update that the majority of prominent Russian military bloggers claimed that Ukrainian forces managed to utilize tactical surprise and land on the East Bank before engaging Russian forces in small arms exchanges, and Saldo was likely purposefully trying to refute claims of Ukrainian presence in this area to avoid creating panic in the already delicate Russian information space. The report added that satellite imagery suggested that a major battle had taken place, and that by the end of the day on 8th of August, many Russian sources had updated their claims to report that Russian forces retained control over Kazachi Laheri, having pushed Ukrainian forces back to the shoreline, and that small arms skirmishes are occurring in shoreline areas near Kazachi Laheri and other East Bank settlements. This development in the fighting also poses a major threat to Russian supply lines and the key transportation hub of Melitopol, which serves as a gateway to the still occupied port cities of Berdyansk and Mariupol. If Ukraine is able to retake these cities, it could cut off Russian support to nearly a third of their soldiers, stationed in the southeast and on the Crimean Peninsula. There are already numerous reports of sabotage train lines between Crimea and Melitopol, which may be impacting Russia's ability to move troops and supplies from one city to the other. These attacks are also only a small part of the broader Ukrainian sabotage operations which continue across the battle space, as well as in Russia itself. There have been twice as many of this type of attack in the first 6 months of 2023 than in the entire previous year. Besides psychologically messing with Russian troops, operations like this also help to weaken key defensive positions. If Ukraine can use them to escalate into a full assault on Melitopol, Berdyansk and Mariupol, that will leave only a single reliable supply route from Russia into Crimea, via the already damaged Kerch Bridge. The previous attack on that bridge, which remains unconfirmed but has been attributed to Ukraine, prove that this is vulnerable to sabotage. From reports and footage, it appeared as though a truck bomb was responsible, one which originated from within Russia's own borders. If Ukraine can pull off another similar attack able to destroy the bridge, it will leave the tens of thousands of Russian troops in Crimea essentially stranded. Even more important, it will leave no way for Russia to move heavy equipment like tanks, artillery systems, and supply vehicles onto the peninsula. This could prove disastrous and severely limit Putin's ability to sustain the war effort. In addition to giving ground under Ukrainian assaults south of the Dnipro, Russian troops have also been forced to retreat on the northern and southern axis of the conflict, near the ruins of the city of Bakhmut. When the Russian PMC Wagner Group announced that they had finally retaken Bakhmut several months back, they also announced that their forces would be pulling away from the front line. This was likely due to the many months of heavy losses. which would also eventually lead Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin to stage his ill-fated mutiny against Putin back in July. Prigozhin announced that he was turning Bakhmut over to the regular Russian forces. Within days of this taking place, Ukraine began systematic attacks on both the northern and southern approaches to the city, working to encircle the Russian troops inside. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar recently stated that, in the Bakhmut sector, 3 square kilometers (1.2 square miles) were liberated last week, and that in total, 40 square kilometers (15.5 square miles) have been liberated on the southern flank of the Bakhmut sector. But this may also continue to shift in Ukraine's favor, as the country receives more and more advanced military supplies from the US and NATO. Some of these have already arrived and been put to use, such as armored vehicles like the German-made Leopard tanks and US Bradley fighting vehicles. Most weapon systems manufactured in the West come with advanced targeting and night warfare capabilities, which Russia has either too few of or lacks entirely. These capabilities have allowed Ukrainian forces to undertake a large number of successful night operations, something experts have recently started pointing to as a major factor behind Ukrainian battlefield gains. Another source of Ukrainian dominance has been the influx of US-made precision artillery, such as the HIMARS rocket system and GPS-guided Excalibur shells. These have provided Ukraine with the ability to target Russian ammunition depots, fuel production facilities, and command and control centers. Combined with the power of long-range Western rockets such as the British-supplied Storm Shadow missile, this has led to several devastating strikes far behind Russian lines. Just weeks ago, Ukraine struck 2 of the bridges in the Crimean Peninsula, with at least 1 hit by Storm Shadow missiles, according to Ukrainian and Russian officials. And that same day, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense released images confirming the arrival of Scalp EG missiles, the French version of the Storm Shadow. The weapons being delivered may also be even more powerful than publicly disclosed. A colonel in Kyiv's Air Defense Command, who was not named, recently told the Times of London that the missiles in Ukraine's possession have twice their publicized range, about 310 miles rather than 155 miles advertised by its manufacturer. There are still options for more powerful systems to be delivered as well. Biden is said to be debating the delivery of the ultra-long-range ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile Systems. ATACMS has a routine range of around 200 miles, as well as highly accurate precision targeting capabilities. Meanwhile, Russia has run so low on ammunition that Putin has been forced to turn to countries like North Korea and Iran to supply artillery shells, some of which are likely more than 50 years old. Reportedly, during a recent test of similar ammunition by North Korea, over a quarter of the shells failed to detonate at all. Iran is also selling their least expensive drones to Russia, including the Shahed 129, Shahed 191, and Mahajr 6 models, which Russia has used to launch indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets and energy infrastructure. While these drones are deadly and terrifying, they are unlikely to be enough to turn the tide of the war. With new Russian weaknesses being exposed every week, Putin also increasingly runs the risk of his top generals turning on him, or ordinary Russians rising up over the staggering losses and failure to achieve any real gains. The frustration over the war is becoming more and more noticeable, even among the tightly censored and controlled Russian media. Igor Strelkov is a former Russian intelligence officer who has boasted that he pulled the war's trigger by leading Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and of ordering the torture and execution of pro-Ukrainian officials, police officers, and war prisoners in Donetsk. Until recently, Strelkov was a rising star in the world of pro-war Russian Telegram bloggers. But after Prigozhin's mutiny, Strelkov posted, among other insults, that for 23 years at the helm of Russia was a nobody who could fool most Russians. 3 days later, he was arrested by Putin's security forces. The discontent has even spread to members of the Duma, Putin's hand-picked group of cronies who form the Russian legislature. One of its most influential members, Konstantin Zachulin, even recently dared to criticize the war in an international forum. Zachulin, who boasts close ties to top leaders of the FSB, said at a conference on the future of Ukraine that Russia had so far failed in all its war efforts, and that some of them had become senseless. Referencing the popular Russian rationale for the war, he stated that the original aims were denazification, demilitarization, neutrality for Ukraine, and the defense of the residents of Donetsk and Luhansk. On which of these points have we reached results today? Not one. Combined with Prigozhin's well-publicized mutiny and flight to Belarus, episodes like this show a Putin who is beginning to lose his grip on the levers of power. In a recent analysis, Tatiana Stanovaya, senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, said Prigozhin had effectively chipped away at Putin's power vertical, or ability to rule effectively from the top down. Because of this, she argues, turmoil from the war is now producing dozens of mini Prigozhins, who are not as smart as the caterer-turned mercenary but have become sure in recent months that post-Putin Russia is already here, even as Putin remains in charge. Putin also faces new international challenges to his authority and possibly freedom. Since even before February 2022, there have been numerous reports of the systematic abduction and relocation of children from the occupied areas of Ukraine. In March of 2023, this led to an arrest warrant for Putin being issued by the International Criminal Court on charges for war crimes. While not an immediate threat, these are further isolating him internationally, putting even his trips to non-aligned countries into jeopardy. For instance, in August, South Africa is hosting a summit for a meeting of the BRICS Group, a loose alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But the month before, South Africa's government stated that Putin would not be attending the summit, and that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov would attend instead. This was largely due to concerns over whether they would have to act on the international arrest warrant due to building public pressure. Developments like this isolate Putin even further, limiting the amount of places he can travel on state business and undermining his legitimacy as leader of Russia. And allegations of mass kidnapping are just the tip of the iceberg as far as war crimes are concerned. The Russian armed forces under direct control of Putin and his generals have been responsible for thousands of acts of torture and murder throughout the war and occupation of Ukraine. For instance, in the town of Bucha, on the outskirts of Kyiv, over 450 civilians were executed with hands tied behind their back and dumped in the streets. An inquiry by Radio Free Europe also discovered the use of a basement beneath a campground as a torture chamber. Many bodies were found mutilated and burnt, while girls as young as 14 reported being raped by Russian soldiers. This is just one massacre among hundreds, many of which are also being investigated by the International Criminal Court. Additionally, the US is currently hosting Ukrainian prosecutors to help them prepare to prosecute such acts. Ultimately, all of the horrifying violence can be laid at Putin's feet. This isn't just guesswork either. He's made it publicly clear, such as by giving medals to the unit responsible for carrying out the murders and other atrocities at Bucha. He has also received charges of ecocide for the destruction of the enormous Novokakhovka Dam, while Putin called the move barbaric and denied Russian involvement. But investigations have all concluded that Russia was responsible, as it controlled the dam before its destruction, while experts have concluded that the breach was caused by an internal explosion of hundreds of pounds of explosives. The dam was designed by the Soviets to withstand a nuclear attack, making it highly unlikely that any missile could have caused the damage it sustained. The dam's destruction is yet another terrible crime for which Putin is to blame. The event also suggests several more implications of his growing desperation. For example, more than 80% of the drinking and agricultural water in Crimea came straight from the lake that the dam controlled via canal. Putin's likely destruction of the dam may signal that he is aware he could lose control over Crimea at some point in the coming months, and is unwilling to let Ukraine have it either. By some estimates, it may take more than a decade for previous levels of drinking water to return to the peninsula. This is the move of a desperate tyrant, lashing out at enemies and lacking the long-term thinking necessary to hold on to power securely. Another factor, often discussed but still crucial, is the damage that Putin has done to Russia's economy and diplomatic presence around the world. Take oil. Russia has been one of the world's top 3 oil producers for decades, behind only the United States and Saudi Arabia. But the harsh sanctions, price caps, and export controls imposed by the US and Europe after the invasion have hit Russia's oil sector hard. This is despite Russia offering a massive $20 per barrel discount in the cost of its crude oil exports, in the hopes of using new buyers like India and China to replace EU members who have largely stopped buying. But that discount, combined with lower volume of sales, means a shortfall of over $65 billion per year. That's not to mention other price declines from the pre-invasion oil market. All things considered, Russia is likely to see a 2023 decline in oil and gas revenue of over $180 billion. A drop of this magnitude is likely to hit ordinary Russians, and possibly even the oligarchs, quite hard. The expenses of the invasion are also hitting the Russian economy more directly now. Putin recently imposed an extra 5% tax on extra profit, made by Russian businesses, something which is basically determined by his cronies in the finance ministry. Another area Russia's economy has been hit hard is in its global military sales. Back in 2011, Russia nearly matched the US in volume of global arms sales. But as the country has become more isolated due to warmongering and its equipment has been shown ineffective, exports have plummeted more than 70%, with 2023 sales to only 12 countries. Western sanctions have also destroyed Russia's ability to obtain advanced computer chips for its modern military equipment, throwing doubt on whether it will be able to produce such systems for more than another year. That's not even getting into the enormous destruction of tanks, artillery, planes, and over 250,000 soldiers. All of this suggests one thing: Putin messed up badly. His war of imperialism has now turned into a series of self-inflicted wounds, which have brought Russia to its lowest point in decades, economically, militarily, and politically. With two new countries joining NATO and Ukraine's membership on the horizon, every aim of the war has become an abject failure. It seems likely that sooner, rather than later, these mistakes will eventually catch up to Putin and be his undoing. But what do you think? Will Putin's war end up pushing him from power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Trench warfare is utterly terrifying, whether it's World War I or the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Crouching knee-deep in mud, waiting breathlessly for the next barrage of shells to come flying in, and then suddenly being ordered by your commanding officers to go over the top. It's the epitome of one's worst nightmare, and it only gets worse. Today, we add to this a new form of wide-eyed, high-definition horror as soldiers who once felt protected by their trenches look up into the sky, only to find a cheap Chinese-made drone release the munition that will, a few seconds hence, end their life. This is trench warfare in a nutshell. A blended mixture of old and new terrors frontline forces in Ukraine are subjected to day in, day out. But we're not here to make generalizations, it's time to delve into reality. Join us today as we take you into the Ukrainian trenches to experience what it's really like to wage this gruesome form of fighting. It's the height of summer 2023 and you are a Russian soldier posted to a newly formed unit defending a stretch of trenches just south of the eviscerated cityscape of Bakhmut. Pressure on your position has been increasing of late. The long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive has been picking up steam elsewhere, according to reports filtering down to your immediate superior. Lately, things have been manageable in your sector, until today. For 2 weeks, you have lived the life of a subterranean mole. The trench system you inhabit is vast. Its interconnected passageways are a self-sustaining warren of protective tunnels, corridors, and holes designed with your survival in mind. You do everything in your trench. Warned to limit your exposure to open air, you know that even the most innocuous outdoor task, ferrying supplies to another position, getting a better radio signal, trying to spot the enemy, or even relieving oneself, is fraught with danger. And in terms of mortal threats, you can pick your poison. Drones, snipers, artillery, mortars, suppressive fire, a frontal assault, a night attack, or the unexpected aerial bombardment. It is all devastating and can end your life in a nanosecond. Today, like most days, the most immediate threat comes from Ukrainian artillery. It starts off with a series of low, rumbling whops, registering in the distance, but the explosions eventually snake closer and closer to your position, crescendoing in noise and concussive shock as they do. This might get hairy, you tell your friend who looks over from his makeshift bed in your shared foxhole. He's much newer than you, fresh on the line. Today marks the end of his first week in Ukraine. You, on the other hand, you're a veteran. After all, you've been on the front lines a whole week longer. You see a bright flash of light as mud, debris, and shrapnel cascade all around you. It's the first explosion that makes you sweat. You drop down instinctively into the fetal position, clutching your knees as you tuck them into your chest. You feel the earth shake beneath you as another round explodes nearby. Soon, the percussive impact lessens, the noise diminishes. When you feel safe enough to lift your head, you realize your jaw is sore from clenching. There's a drop of blood coming from your nose. That was a close call, you grunt to your comrade. He doesn't respond. Your heart sinks into your chest as you glance over across the foxhole. He's slumped over his half-empty pack, staring lifelessly into the ground. In the span of 1 week, you had both escaped death twice. Deep down, the way things were, you knew it was asking too much to hope both of you might survive a third, death-defying ordeal. Fate doesn't work like that in Ukraine. No, here the margins are slim, and prospects for emerging from the trenches in one piece are grim for Russian conscripts at the front. Someone is bound to get hit. Today, you're simply grateful it wasn't you. Mortar rounds begin to fall outside your foxhole. There's no time to mourn or bury the dead. You hunker down, hoping your own artillery can counter and silence the Ukrainian units causing such devastation to your trench network. It doesn't. Another day goes by, and you curse Moscow for your side's munition shortages and the laxity with which you were trained for this type of warfare. 2 days go by, and the shelling barely lets up for more than an hour or two. By the third day, you've had enough. Around 3 a.m., the front quiets down. You try to sleep, but you're haunted by the stiff, silent, unmoving body of your fallen friend. 4 hours later, another explosion snaps you from your light sleep. Disorientated and dazed, you hear shooting and more shelling, and soon notice that a crater has replaced the logs which previously covered the entrance to your foxhole. Now it's just you in the open air. There's no point sticking around. Now's your chance. You take it. Dropping your rifle, you sprint to the open, vaulting over craters and bodies blown to pieces by incessant shelling. You dive into another foxhole. Only then do you hear the low rumble of a vehicle idling nearby. Is it friendly? Is it Ukrainian? You wait, unable to make out more than an outline in the fog. The voices of Ukrainian soldiers dispel your doubts. You barely have time to process what to do next. Before you can react, 2 grenades land with a clink nearby. You hug the dirt at the base of your foxhole, and shrapnel from the blast whizzes overhead. You're surrounded, and know that if you stand, you'll be executed. If you stay, you'll probably die too. Maybe it wouldn't hurt as much if you just decided to accept your fate and lay there inert. For a split second, you contemplate turning your own rifle on yourself and ending your life. The Ukrainians appear over the lip of your foxhole, shouting at you from the other end of their smoking M4s. You're not dead. You raise your hands. You can hardly believe your luck. Within the hour, you are blindfolded and loaded into the back of a Ukrainian BMP, headed somewhere safe. You begin to sob silently an hour later, when at a makeshift jail, a Ukrainian officer of the 3rd Assault Brigade offers you and 7 other Russian prisoners a cigarette. After you've been processed, you are greeted by a Western reporter wearing a blue bulletproof vest and a helmet. He introduces himself in Russian and tells you he works for CNN, an American news outlet. "I want to know what things are like in the trenches around Bakhmut," he says. "Will you tell me?" You decide to grant him an interview, on the condition of anonymity. He accepts. For the next hour, you relive the horrors you have experienced. For 3 days, shells and mortars were flying and whistling overhead. "Exploding around us," you say. "We were jumping like rabbits under mortar rounds and bombs." He nods without emotion and scratches a series of notes onto the pad resting on his knee. You tell him that your fallen partner had been an ex-convict, promised by the Russian government his record would be cleansed if he served in Ukraine. 2 weeks of training was simply not enough. "We had no morale," you add. "We expected to be holding the line of defense as we were promised. We were told Wagner PMC was the one involved in active hostilities, and that we would be the ones stationed on the liberated territories. As it was explained to us earlier, the Russian state media had lied, and you had only realized it when it was too late. It felt like a betrayal." The reporter simply nods, jotting down another note as though he's heard this story 100 times already. Indeed, your story is not unique. Not for you, for the other Russians like you, nor for the Ukrainians you were falsely told would execute you on sight. Nearby, you hear another prisoner, Sergei, tell a reporter how he had shouted "surrender" as grenades killed everyone else in his foxhole. "I hid in the trenches. Those who wanted to run from one position to another were simply shot down by machine guns and tanks," he said, wincing. "Our artillery, as usual, did not work. Then ours tried Grad rocket launchers, but they kept missing. Then I heard the Ukrainians approaching us. I started shouting, 'We surrender!' Then they threw a grenade at us. I felt it cut my hand. They asked me who I am, and I said that I am Russian and that I surrender. I started to get up, and a second grenade arrived. I managed to crawl halfway out of the trench in a second. I was lucky, twice, that I wasn't killed by the grenade, and that I surrendered as a prisoner." Sergei's is yet another personal episode of thousands playing out each and every day. Trench warfare is nothing new in the history of human conflict. Caesar's legions relied on entrenchments and ramparts in their siege of Gaul 2,000 years ago. In the 15th and 16th centuries, new artillery fortresses could only be reduced by extended sieges and supply strangulation enacted by trenches dug closer and closer to the erstwhile attackers. Over time, these tactics gained traction as French engineers perfected the art of siegecraft in the 17th century. Eventually, improved firepower and industrialized warfare forced vulnerable armies underground. By late 1914, trench warfare became enshrined as doctrine, when the bloody stalemate on the Western Front inspired the creation of multiple, self-reinforcing trench networks to blunt frontal attacks and protect hard-earned territory. The defensive dogma would continue well through the Great War until greater concentrations of coordinated air power, armor, and artillery were used to break the deadlock and reintroduce a semblance of mobility to the battlefield. Today in Ukraine, it feels like a redux of the trench-infused carnage of World War I. Similarities, on the surface at least, are striking. The structures of trenches today and those 100 years ago are incredibly alike. There are frontline dugouts, labyrinthine underground tunnels, and close-in peepholes looking out into no man's land, all supported by wooden beams holding back earthen walls and ceilings. There are makeshift command posts, first aid stations, hospitals, kitchens, latrines, and more. Men in forward observation posts must keep away from crude openings for fear of snipers. They keep eyes on their enemy by use of binocular periscopes. Time-tested landline connections and old-school rotary phones are often more reliable in this harsh environment than GPS, which enemies can jam, and radio signals, which can be easily intercepted. Cell phones are banned on the front. More than once, hackers have triangulated and destroyed high-profile concentrations of enemy units using their roaming signals, which automatically connected to Ukraine's cellular network via the closest cell towers. Experts, however, are warning that most comparisons to World War I are overstated. The scale of artillery being fired in Ukraine, for one, is simply dwarfed by the artillery duels of World War I, despite the devastation we've seen. The trenches themselves are far cruder than those intricate networks which wound across the Western Front from 1914 to 18. Troop density, too, is far less. During the Somme offensive of 1916, there was an average of almost 10,000 troops per mile on each side. In Ukraine today, there are around 700 troops per mile. Still, the precedent is there, and trench warfare is a style of fighting few had on their bingo cards in February 2022, especially in an era of precision-guided munitions, advanced tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, drones, night vision, and other highly modernized combat systems. The rationale for falling back on trench warfare in Ukraine is the same as it was a century ago. Trenches shield and protect their occupants. They camouflage you in relatively flat terrain, which Ukraine possesses in abundance. They enable you to withstand more and defend far easier, precisely what the Russians needed after the shock dual losses of Kharkiv and Kherson last year. Modern trench warfare is punctuated by a blend of new and ageless features, drones and electronic warfare assets mixed with mines, mechanized vehicles, and artillery. Today, as in times past, the prospect of storming no man's land is as daunting as ever. And it is the depth of these prickly defenses and the difficulty in penetrating them which caused this conflict, which truly commenced in 2014, to stagnate for 8 years before Putin renewed his bellicose ambitions. It is the same reason that Ukraine, for all its courage and pluck, has struggled to move the needle in this latest counteroffensive. Russia simply had the time and the resources to double down on the land it seized in 2022. Undoing that has been a Herculean task for Zelensky's legions. So how do you storm a trench in 2023? It is a question which has been at the forefront of Ukraine's offensive operations for a year now, and one which, since 2014, they pondered until now, lacking resources to offer up a realistic answer. And the answer is painfully simple: to advance. There is no other option but to storm and dislodge the enemy from their entrenched positions. For decades, the Soviets approached this timeless question with a brutal brand of tactics which Putin's forces have inherited. It is known as reconnaissance by combat, and essentially means sending soldiers over the top as bait, waiting for them to get shot at, and then sending in another wave of forces armed, hopefully, with the newly gleaned data of where the enemy is hiding. Ukraine is far more wary of sacrificing their men like animals, and so has tried to employ alternative means. The approach for them is to pummel, pressure, and suppress enemy emplacements with artillery and air power, and then advance using combined arms tactics. Mechanized vehicles when they've had them in enough numbers, supported by artillery, mortars, and drones, which disgorge squads of infantry and sow panic, causing enemy soldiers to flee the safety of their trenches. If you need an example of how to effectively pull this off, look no further than the actions conducted by Ukraine's 59th Brigade on July 9, 2023. In released video footage, advancing Ukrainian forces suppressed the enemy with mortars and grenades, peppering Russian trenches with withering fire to cover the advance of shock troops coming through no man's land in armored vehicles. Their rapid approach confronted the Russians with 3 decisions: flee, surrender, or double down. For those who chose the latter, the Ukrainians entered the trenches and cleared the stunned Russians of all resistance. If they made it look easy, it was anything but. These were supremely motivated Ukrainian soldiers, the Russians the exact opposite. Not every Russian position, however, is the same. In other scenarios, the outcome could have been far different. With enough supplies, ammunition, and gear, clearing a group of defenders from their trenches becomes almost impossible. Doing so requires immense mental, physical, and emotional fortitude. Ukraine has learned this lesson in the School of Hard Knocks. The supreme danger of clearing trenches inspired them to form a specialized unit of the 73rd Naval Special Operations Center, NSOC, a distinguished group whose sole purpose is to enter and clear Russian trenches in harrowing close-quarters combat. These guys are the real deal. According to John Spencer, chair of urban warfare studies at West Point's Modern War Institute, the commandos are highly trained, good weapons handling, use of grenades, intense, high adrenaline but not chaotic. The ability to manage chaos manifested itself in a recently released video depicting Ukrainian special operators from this unit clearing an enemy trench in southern Ukraine. In most situations, trench assaults rely on luck and skill to survive. Entering from the trench's rear, they achieve complete surprise, rushing through tight spaces, covering each other's blind spots, and dispatching confused enemies running into their line of fire like lemmings. Their professionalism was on full display. It was gritty. It was hot. It was difficult to see and hear what was going on, but before the enemy knew what hit them, 10 Russians were neutralized. That such highly trained units are being used to clear trenches is evidence of the sense of priority Ukrainian commanders have assigned to this job, as they are pressured to advance and seize back territory. These special units have benefited from Western training dating back to 2014. Around that time, a cadre of American special operators, including Green Berets of the US Army's 10th Special Forces Group, as well as other NATO units, began training Ukrainian operators in unconventional warfare, small unit tactics, and close-quarters combat, skills which have come in handy in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and elsewhere where house-to-house combat became the norm. Now in the trenches, they are applying the same skills which ordinarily take years to master. But average soldiers on both sides are also asked to do the grunt work of clearing trenches. There are dedicated units for this known as Shturmoviki, literally meaning stormtroops. Small unit assault forces like Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade operate with the sole job of storming and clearing trenches. For them and others, the basic fact of trench warfare, at least when it is a square infantry on infantry engagement, is that every outcome hinges on the element of surprise. Whoever is caught off guard first dies. That truism, along with the necessity of achieving fire superiority, governs the nature of combat in the trenches. When you are thrown into one of these encounters, courage and fear go hand in hand. For an example of this, look no further than the experience of another Ukrainian battalion whose existential struggle for survival in a place appropriately labeled Dead Man's Trench was recorded on mounted body and head cams. Like our Russian scenario at the beginning of this video, this encounter happened near Bakhmut and was, in the words of one reporter, a clear and visceral demonstration of what the young men of Ukraine and Russia are doing day after terrifying day. The unit in question was led by a 30-something man named Alexander, a Ukrainian doctor who nearly a decade ago decided his time would be better spent fighting for his country's freedom. His team inhabited a grungy, muddy trench filled with the rotting corpses of Russian dead. Alexander begins to film as he arrives back at the trench, coincidentally, right as Russian artillery begins to fall nearby. When he enters a foxhole crammed with other Ukrainian soldiers, he finds them shocked and stunned. One of their own is dead on the floor of the foxhole, killed by artillery. A commander grabs a shovel and begins to shore up the defenses when another round strikes the mouth of the foxhole, knocking him to the ground with small fragments of shrapnel riddling his back. Within minutes, news breaks that the Russians are now advancing across no man's land. Alexander and the others grab their rifles, clamber out of the foxhole, and immediately stumble into a firefight. There's little ammo. Russian soldiers can be seen just yards away on camera lobbing a grenade that narrowly misses the mark. Alexander is shouting orders which are barely audible above the din. Of the 8 others around him, only 4 have battle experience. In the maelstrom, advancing Russians are shot down on the right and left. Finally, Ukrainian artillery begins to fall, covering the defenders. Ukrainian soldiers using drones begin to call out and anticipate Russian actions on the radio. Soon, the men are ordered back to their trench. Against the odds, they've held their position. They lost 2 men in the process. Back in the rear, Alexander explains to a war correspondent the critical moment of the engagement. When he emerged from the trench and saw the Russian lobbing a grenade, he is sure that if the Russian had targeted the mouth of the foxhole instead of him, his entire squad would have been wiped out. The odds are rarely in your favor in the trenches, but fortunately for Alexander, Lady Luck smiled on him that day. Trench engagements in Ukraine tend to last an average of 10 minutes. Some firefights can drag on for as long as 30. In many cases, weaponry, not just terrain, is being fought for. Captured vehicles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces are just as useful to one side as the other. The nature of trench warfare in Ukraine has been the catalyst for renewed calls for better, more effective armaments from Western nations, including improved main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, as well as cluster munitions and F-16 fighters. The compartmental nature of the 700-mile front, now cut up by fortifications, trenches, natural barriers like forests, tree lines, and rivers, and seemingly endless stretches of minefields has immensely complicated the task of turning the Russian flank. As the ongoing Ukrainian offensive demonstrates, the introduction of more modern fighting implements is no guarantee of success. This conflict, like World War I, is trending towards strategic atrophy. Ukraine has no other choice but to claw its territory back inch by inch. No matter what, the cost will be high. On that note, it is fitting then that we end by acknowledging the overlooked and underappreciated price combatants from both sides will pay for their time in the trenches, and that is, of course, the unimaginable psychological scars produced by such events. Thousands, even tens of thousands of men who survive this modern iteration of trench warfare will have lived, survived, and suffered under the omnipresent fear of death. Few, if any of us, know what that truly feels like. Most of the time, there is no sense of urgency. You live from hour to hour, awaiting provocation. An overwhelming sense of uncertainty blankets the stalemate. Voices carry easily across no man's land. Everyone is afraid, one Ukrainian noted. We are afraid and the Russians are afraid of us. Moments of tension, apprehension, and anxiety punctuate otherwise empty hours. Signs of movement send chills down the spine. The ones who are not afraid are fools, the Ukrainian soldier adds. We are all afraid. Once you've experienced this, without proper treatment, there is simply no place of comfort left in the world. There will always be the threat of death, even in places where to others it may feel completely safe. The real price of trench warfare, then, is a psychological one. Living day in, day out in this soul-sapping environment without a lull or proper break, you cannot lose focus for even a second. You rely entirely on your comrades for safety and support, yet once the shelling starts, once you go over the top, you can only hear the pounding of your own heart. One journalist put it best: although no man's land is measured in yards or miles, the gulf between life and death is never more distant than a few inches or seconds. Such is the reality of trench warfare. What surprised you most about today's video? Is there any other specific part of the Ukraine conflict you'd like us to talk about next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Why has Russia done so badly in its invasion of Ukraine? And what explains Ukraine's successful defense against its aggressive larger neighbor? And will its current counteroffensive be effective? If you've read or watched the news at all in the last year, you've probably heard a dozen different takes on how and why things have gone the way they have. Explanations for the war's current state range from Russian incompetence to Western military and logistical support to Ukrainian grit and superior strategy. The reality is that all of these factors and many more have led to this stage in the war, and will determine how the conflict may change in the next year. There is also another explanation, once recently pointed out by Telegraph associate editor and British Army veteran Tom Nichols, which can also tell us a lot about the war's future. It involves a way of looking at conflicts which is nicely summed up by an old military adage: armies don't fight wars, nations fight wars. Armies just do the shooting. Let's go over what Nichols means by this phrase, its significance for Ukraine and Russia's strategies, and what it tells us about how modern wars are really won today, both on and off the battlefield. First, in order to really understand the chances of Ukraine or Russia's strategies leading to success, we need to consider the conflict in terms of national will, not just battlefield activity. The collective will of a nation to reach certain military, economic, political, and societal objectives is critical. It can determine whether a country can coordinate and deploy resources against an enemy. In the West, there was a lack of political and economic will to nation-build in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as a result, military superiority alone couldn't achieve the desired outcomes. Russia is now dealing with its own, far more severe crisis of national will, something made worse by Putin's brutal, corrupt, and authoritarian rule. Ukraine, on the other hand, has seen collective national will manifest in all sorts of places since the start of the invasion. Nichols points out that another way to analyze national will in a military campaign is through the geographic lens of deep, close, and rear operations. In the most straightforward sense, deep operations consist of things like long-range strikes and precise raids behind enemy lines to disrupt key assets. Close operations are generally thought of as brutal, close-quarters combat necessary to take territory, and rear operations consist of non-combat support elements like headquarters, supply lines, and logistics bases. Like other elements in military doctrine, these three areas are not exact guidelines for warfighting, but instead a lens, or loose conceptual framework, that helps everyone from commanders to analysts assess issues, opportunities, and the larger operational environment of a conflict. The biggest challenge for anyone engaged in a military campaign is to align the various parts and sections of a country to serve the broader goal of warfare. This means that everybody from foot soldiers and drone operators to civilians watching their TV screens back home must be on board with the conflict. In this sense, Nichols is very right to point out that deep, close, and rear operations can be understood as far more than just physical, geographic elements. Rather, they entail what he calls the architecture needed for the battle in the mind, the area where wars are really won or lost. What does this mean? For one thing, modern conflicts, especially long ones, are rarely won just through overwhelming firepower or number of troops. Instead, they require the combination of many disparate elements from across society to bolster the morale of one nation and destroy another's will to fight. The first takeaway, while obvious, is one Putin seems to have forgotten. A military strategy lacking in national or international support is far, far less likely to succeed. As Nichols argues, in this broader understanding, deep operations are often psychological, aiming to intimidate and unsettle the enemy with a range of tools. For instance, General Kirilla Badanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, recently posted a tweet where he spent 30 seconds staring at the camera without saying a word. This plans of silence video showed a stoic self-confidence meant to terrify any Russian conscript who watched it, an ominous "you're not ready for what's coming." Other psychological deep operations are aimed at allies around the world, intended to drum up external support and convey the message that we're on the same team. With Ukraine, we see this every time President Zelensky or Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov have traveled abroad to show that unlike Putin's Russia, their country is part of the rules-based international order. We saw this strategy in full swing earlier in July, during the annual NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. As the event kicked off, the city's walls were full of blue and yellow posters, Ukrainian flags hung on every street, and many locals told stories about their own memories of Russian imperialism. Zelensky appeared to a screaming crowd of thousands calling for Ukraine's NATO accession and increased support in the years ahead. His appearance was a strong signal that Ukraine is on NATO's team, and that both share a common vision of the future. And this type of deep operation seems to be highly effective. Karolina Vitoniene, a Vilnius local, who watched alongside friends and her daughter, told reporters that it was very emotional. "We understand that they, the Ukrainians, are fighting for our freedom as well. Each of us remembers what it's like to live under occupation, or knows the stories from their families." It is this sort of common cause that has helped with Zelensky's massive international support. The 37-year-old recalled her childhood nightmares that a Russian tank would roll over her home, stating that she wanted her daughter to grow up in a world where that would not be possible. For a war effort to succeed in our modern, hyper-connected world, this type of support is critical, and to maintain it, the leaders of a military campaign must be constantly engaged in outreach to their coalition of international supporters. Doing so gives Ukraine economic leverage over Russia, keeps vital military supplies flowing into the country, and ensures that the Ukrainian cause remains seen as morally righteous and worthy of support by key allies. Psychological rear operations are also critical for a successful military campaign. They offer hope to a nation's own citizens, aiming to keep morale high and a national spirit intact, even while they remain under constant threat. Ukraine's leaders have also engaged heavily in this sort of rear operation, using everything from Twitter to in-person visits to the front lines to Zelensky's appearance at the Kyiv Book Fair. Some of the most potent of these efforts resulted in words which inspired millions of Ukrainians to fight tooth and nail for their country. Remember the video of Ukraine's cabinet remaining in Kyiv just after the invasion began, or the now famous statement, "I need ammunition, not a ride." This sort of determination from a nation's leaders can have an enormous impact on citizens' willingness to fight and possibly die for a cause. It's not just words during moments of crisis either. Some psychological rear operations are effective because they take place during ordinary moments worth defending. Zelensky attending a book fair might seem like a weird thing for a wartime president to do, but it makes perfect sense through his lens. Natalia Gomenyuk, the book fair's events curator, asked one reporter, "What is democracy? How do we experience freedom? What do we mean by inclusivity or the unity of the country? And are these values really worth fighting and dying for?" The war made these questions real instead of abstract, and Zelensky's presence at such an ordinary event signaled to his audience that he does not take them for granted. This can be an incredibly powerful tool during wartime, keeping the civilian population on board with military operations, even when there is no end in sight. By showing that normal life is something worth fighting and putting your life on the line for, Ukrainian officials offer both a rallying cry and a goal for post-conflict existence. Even close operations, usually thought of as only brutal frontline combat, have a psychological dimension. Soldiers need to be inspired both before and during their deployments, especially since life in the trenches is often miserable and terrifying. In Ukraine, the military has set up multiple organizations to deal with this problem. One, the Center for Moral and Psychological Support, helps mentally prepare soldiers for the dangers and stresses of forward deployment. The head of the center, Captain Andriy Karachevsky, had PTSD himself and has explained that it's an intervention prior to combat. We are part of the weaponry. We give them skills to deal with combat. How a soldier is to understand the range of emotions from anger to grief to confusion and many more that he may feel. How a soldier is to manage what he is feeling both there and afterwards. The other goal of such centers is to prevent as many mental health crises as possible among active and returning soldiers, by promoting inclusive and emotionally aware leadership among battlefield commanders. The hope is that doing so will prevent Ukraine's overstretched armed forces from breaking down. It's also a way to change stigmas around mental health, by making it easier and more acceptable for people to seek out psychological help. Much like inspiring speeches or visits to the book fair, this type of operation is just another way Ukraine's leaders are working to keep their entire nation on board with a war that doesn't look to be stopping anytime soon. And like the others, it shows us a fundamental truth about conflicts. Often the victor is whichever side can best maintain and channel a sense of collective purpose and unity of action. And as important as the psychological elements of a military campaign can be, the underlying moral structure of a military campaign can be just as critical. These values form a thread, which can either bind a society together or allow it to fray under the stresses of conflict. The moral values supporting Ukraine's campaign include self-determination, freedom from violence, and democracy, a powerful combination for supporters both at home and around the world. In Putin's Russia, on the other hand, the thread is one of grievance, fear, self-interest, and domination. Unlike in Ukraine, these are not the sort of values that make for a unified and successful campaign. Instead, they are the type of ideas that erode a nation's moral and psychological foundations. Put another way, the climate of Putin's Russia makes it pretty clear to conscripts and generals alike that their lives and opinions are meaningless. Basically, they're not the sort of ideals that could inspire some poor conscript on the front lines that what he is doing really matters at all. These ideas are part of what is sometimes called soft power, the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction rather than force. Ukraine's war effort has created huge amounts of its own soft power, as supporters rally online, post memes, crowdfund operations, and take to the streets. Meanwhile, the Russian invasion has had very little soft power from the start, with most of the world rejecting Putin's imperialist vision of the world. Political scientist Joseph Nye, who coined the term, described it as the simple fact that the best propaganda is not propaganda, and in the internet age, credibility is the scarcest resource. People around the world saw Putin's insane speeches and Russia's invasion begin on TV, computer and phone screens, and that's what has given Ukraine an edge in support for more than a year. This is yet another part of national will, as soft power influences whether a nation stands alone or with a coalition, and whether it can outlast its enemies. If soldiers on the battlefield feel that there are allies big and small behind them, there is also likely to be better morale and performance in the field. Putin does not have this type of soft power appeal, but knows that he can't continue to rule totally alone. Because of this, every time he has tried to engage in psychological deep, close and rear operations, the results appear forced and unnatural. Years and years of Putin's brutal rule have left modern Russia as a place of staggering corruption and oppression, where daily life for millions is defined by fear and helplessness at the feet of a thankless government. It's very hard to build an effective society and military off of this model, especially when enough people see through the illusion created by those in power. This disconnect is obvious when we see Putin, who meets his advisors deep inside one of his personal fortresses and across the length of a huge table, suddenly appearing in Dagestan to greet crowds of seemingly adoring fans. Rather than showing unity, like Zelensky in Vilnius or at the book fair, Putin's actions come off as callous and fake. Why? Because anyone not neck-deep in Russian propaganda can see his obvious disregard and contempt for the lives of ordinary citizens. The illusion holds only through his iron fist and willingness to kill, torture, imprison, or exile anyone who might be a threat. And nothing is worse for real national will than a system glued together only by terror. When it fails, we start to see the cracks in a tyrant's rule. Christopher Bort, a scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has written a lot about this idea. In his view, one of the most enduring features of the Russian government is a willingness by its leaders to sacrifice ordinary people's lives for their personal goals. The ruler's needs have always come first, and Putin is just the latest in a long line of self-serving men in power. For instance, then US General Eisenhower was apparently in disbelief when Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov told him the standard method for clearing minefields during the Second World War was to send unknowing infantry troops across them as if the mines were not there. Putin's presidency and strategy in Ukraine show a similar lack of concern for human life. Bort points out the clear parallel that prior to Russia's invasion, for instance, the Kremlin's chain of command appears not to have told Russian soldiers that they were about to enter Ukraine to fight a real war. Afterward, the same chain of command neglected to claim those soldiers' bodies because acknowledging their deaths might embarrass the Kremlin. That probably doesn't surprise you by this point, which says something about how predictably horrible Putin's war strategy has become. And while we haven't yet seen the dam of Putin's support break yet, a broader analysis of the conflict shows that things can't last forever. Considering deep, close and rear operations in the way Nichols lays out gives us a picture of a Russia failing badly in many areas, not just on the battlefield. No country can fight forever if its national will for a conflict is exhausted, a lesson the West has learned the hard way. Nichols offers a reminder that during the post-9/11 war on terror, the United Kingdom outsourced many of its military operations in the Middle East to its defense ministry and contractors, with a lack of interest by the central government or public. The same can be said about the United States, which relied heavily on superior military power and outsourced much of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to private contractors. Eventually, conflict fatigue, loss of life and money, and the persistent harsh reality on the ground has led to both wars widely being considered as failures. Most recently, this led to the US military pullout from Afghanistan and Taliban re-takeover in 2020, capping 2 decades of unachieved national objectives. Things have already gone far worse for Putin in Ukraine than they did for the West in Iraq or Afghanistan, but he does not seem to have learned his lesson. And because of his autocratic rule, he also can't seem to get that when a country's psychological operations on the battlefield, the hearts and minds of citizens, and towards the international community are unified, it makes for a tough opponent. Ukraine has pulled this off, and achieved a level of unity by its military commanders, political leaders, and civil society that Putin never has and will never have. Ukraine is fighting this war with a common purpose, while most Russians are fighting it out of fear and for the whims of a powerful man. The good news is that a country like that can never win, not really. War is not just fought on the battlefield but also in the minds of soldiers and civilians, the halls of diplomatic summits, and the press of a book fair. The way countries win wars is by bringing the efforts of an entire society into alignment and preserving national will longer than the enemy. Putin can't do that. Instead, he largely sits alone in his fortress, trusting nobody and caring for nobody, unable to really bring most Russians or countries around the world onto his side. It's the inevitable crack in his armor, and that's why Russia's military can't outlast Ukraine's. Finally, it's also the reason why we shouldn't judge the success of Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive yet. So far, it has been far more about determining Russia's logistical and defense capabilities, harming enemy morale, and shoring up Ukraine's own geopolitical support from crucial allies. While there has been some increase in direct combat, it's nothing like we saw during the last fall counteroffensive. Basically, it looks like Zelensky and his top officials are playing a broader game this time around, potentially hoping to change the balance of power. So we shouldn't count Ukraine out now or anytime soon, especially since its unified national will is a clear long-term advantage. Whether this war lasts another year, 2 or more, Putin's Russia is not in a place that can hold on forever. But what do you think? Is Nichols right about how important national will is in today's conflicts? And will it let Ukraine outlast Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. At this point, we're pretty sure that Putin is sticking his head into a paper bag in panic and trying not to hyperventilate on a daily basis. While he has several reasons for doing this, losing thousands of tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine, the ongoing NATO expansion, coup attempts, and more, there's another looming threat that he can't seem to escape. Ukraine is equipped with US weapons, and Russia can't seem to stop them. But why? Is Putin really that incompetent? What are these weapons, and how come Putin can't fight them off? Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began more than a year ago, the United States has committed more than $45 billion worth of aid to help the country defend its sovereignty. Much of this has taken the form of high-tech, lethal military equipment. The assistance has proven to be critical for Ukraine's battlefield success and a nightmare for Putin and his top military planners. Now, 19 months into the conflict, it could make all the difference in Ukraine's slowly growing counteroffensive. So let's take a look at what equipment the US has sent so far. What else might it be planning to send, and why Russian troops seem to be so helpless against US-exported firepower. Among the most important weapons the US has sent so far to Ukraine is the FGM-148 Javelin, a potent anti-tank guided missile system or ATGM. Jointly manufactured by defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, the Javelin first entered service in 1996 as a replacement for the older M47 Dragon missile. It has also proven to be one of the most effective pieces of US military aid. Ukraine has received more than 7,000 Javelins since the start of the invasion, and has put them to remarkable use. Each Javelin system consists of 2 parts: the launch tube assembly and the reusable command launch unit, or CLU. The CLU works as the brains of the Javelin, and features 4 times magnification as well as night vision and thermal sights. This allows for independent target verification, meaning small, independent squads can use Javelins effectively. Before firing, a 12 times magnification setting allows users to zoom in on a target for identification. To fire, the gunner switches to a Seeker FOV mode with 9 times magnification, which is fed into the missile's guidance unit to lock onto a target. One of the Javelin's biggest strengths is its trajectory. It features 2 modes, direct fire and top attack. In top attack mode, its missiles travel in a high arc, in order to strike the less armored section of a tank at the top of its turret. Its automatic infrared guidance and fire and forget design also allows the user to seek cover immediately after launch and avoid retaliatory strikes. Javelins can also penetrate even the toughest tank armor, as they are fitted with powerful 19-pound tandem warheads. A primary charge penetrates the thick composite armor, while a secondary charge follows and detonates inside the tank. However, these features also make Javelins expensive, at about $200,000 per unit and $78,000 per replacement missile. Money aside, Javelins have become a staple of Ukraine's defense throughout the war so far, even being turned into an inspirational internet meme termed Saint Javelin by Ukrainian-Canadian journalist Christian Boris. Even as the invasion shifted into its current brutal back and forth of artillery barrages trench warfare, the Javelin has continued to prove invaluable to Ukrainian forces. Countless videos like this one shared by Yahoo News have shown unsuspecting Russian troops and tank columns rolling into ambushes by javelin-wielding Ukrainians. As the javelins are fired, tanks and other armored vehicles can be seen exploding and catching fire. One tank was able to fire before it was struck and immobilized, billowing smoke. At one point in the video, 3 desperate Russian soldiers can be seen jumping out of a burning vehicle and running away from it. Scenes like this show why the javelin is among the most effective tools the US has given Ukraine to beat back Russia, but their usefulness has a lot to do with the issues in Russian combat doctrine. Russian tank tactics, which have not evolved much since the 1990s, involve operating tank columns on their own, without the aid of close infantry support. Usually in modern combined arms warfare, infantry units support tanks by keeping hunter-killer teams away while putting down covering fire and stopping columns from rolling into ambushes. But because Russia operates its armor independently, Ukrainian troops have been able to use javelins and other ATGMs to wreak havoc on unsuspecting tanks. The next crucial US weapon which has been utilized in Ukraine are several varieties of kamikaze drones. These have become a serious thorn in Putin's side, giving him a small taste of his own medicine. First is the Switchblade. The drone's name comes from the way the spring-loaded wings are folded up inside a tube and flipped out once released. Designed and manufactured by California defense company Avex Aerospace, Switchblade drones are light and small enough to fit in a backpack. Launched from a portable 2-foot tube, each drone flies to the target area and can loiter, waiting for its target for up to an hour. Once the target approaches, an operator instructs the drone to dive toward enemy personnel and detonate a small grenade-like charge, releasing a shotgun spray of shrapnel in a specific direction. Its loitering nature means that unlike most other weapons, the Switchblade can wave off or abort a mission if the situation changes after launch, allowing it to engage a secondary target or destroy itself without inflicting casualties or damage to property. Its small size and extended operation time also make it great for destroying entrenched infantry, or even lightly armored vehicles like trucks. Videos like this one, shared on Twitter by open-source analyst Abraxas Spar, show Ukrainian operators launching Switchblades from city streets, before retreating to hidden positions to help guide them. While there are no definitive numbers on targets eliminated with Switchblade drones, it seems likely that they have accounted for hundreds of Russian casualties and equipment losses. There are also 2 varieties of the drone, the 300 and 600 models. The Switchblade 300 was widely used by US troops in Afghanistan against the Taliban, but considered less than ideal for the higher intensity warfare in Ukraine. Most of those given to Ukraine appear to be the 600 model, which is much larger and heavier, but has a longer flight time and larger payload, making it ideal for taking out heavy armor or fortified positions. But US military aid extended beyond the Switchblade as well. The Pentagon has also given Ukrainian forces a number of Phoenix Ghost drones. These were also developed by Avex under the US military's Big Safari weapons program, meant to rapidly acquire and deploy weapons to meet unexpected threats without relying on new research and development. The US has supplied over 1,000 of these killer drones so far, which have proven to be similarly lethal in the hands of Ukrainian operators. While even the larger Switchblades are limited to an hour of loitering, the Phoenix Ghost can hover over an area for up to 6 hours at a time, making it a much deadlier surprise weapon. It can also conduct both day and nighttime surveillance, thanks to its advanced infrared sensors, but like the Switchblade, once a target has been detected and identified, the drone dives downwards and explodes on impact. The primary downside of the Phoenix Ghost drone appears to be its reduced speed, which appears in videos to be roughly half that of the Switchblade 600. Even so, Alexei Arestovich, advisor to the Ukrainian president's office, told reporters last year that 580 of such units equals about 350 destroyed targets in the close rear, indicating a roughly 60% success rate. It's unclear how much this has changed, but it seems likely that US-supplied loitering munitions continue to play a big role in Ukraine's ability to strike behind Russian lines. The latest US aid package to Ukraine from July 2023, containing over $1.3 billion of equipment, also reportedly contains hundreds of new Switchblades and Phoenix Ghosts. This is especially important since Kyiv acknowledged in May that its forces are losing about 10,000 drones per month during both intelligence gathering and strike activities. Similarly, military experts have said the relatively large losses of troops and slow advance of Ukrainians' recently launched counteroffensive are due primarily to the dense landmines Russian troops have laid in anticipation. That potentially deadly terrain separating defenders from invading forces will therefore make additional drones capable of inflicting precise attacks on distant targets especially useful. But just why is Russia having so much trouble dealing with these US-made drones? The simple answer is that the country hasn't effectively prepared for modern warfare. Despite its pre-invasion claims that its military could take on even the USA, the fact of the matter is that Russian commanders have proven they have no idea how to wage modern, combined arms warfare. By keeping different elements of their forces isolated and working individually, rather than in coordination, everything from Russian armor to supply lines to infantry troops are far more vulnerable than they should be. There's also the small problem that intelligence gathering among different elements of the Russian military is essentially non-existent. Because different Russian officials are constantly out to get each other and competing for power and influence, they have a strong incentive to let each other's forces take most of the losses, to try and preserve their own power. Obviously, this doesn't work very well when you're facing a determined and increasingly well-armed enemy like Ukraine. The astronomical Russian casualties after a year and a half of fighting are proof enough that Western smart munitions like the Switchblade and Phoenix Ghost are more than Putin's commanders can handle. The less obvious answer is that while Russia is especially unprepared, very few militaries today are prepared to effectively counter the threat of loitering aerial munitions. Just about any force on the planet, including the US itself, would be hard-pressed to defend against repeated strikes by kamikaze drones. There's simply no way to provide infantry troops with effective protection from them, especially as anti-aircraft guns can almost never hit every drone launched. The best way to defend against something like the Switchblade or Phoenix Ghost are electronic countermeasures, such as EMP pulses, which can knock out the signal of overhead drones. Even so, Russia simply does not have the capabilities to stop their strikes, making these some of the most effective weapons supplied to Ukraine so far. Another critical piece of military hardware that Russia has struggled against is the Stinger missile system. At the start of the war, large numbers of Russian aircraft were operating over Ukraine's airspace, leading to predictions that they would soon establish air superiority. But this wasn't on the cards either. And one main reason is the FIM-92 Stinger missile and its counterparts from around the world given to Ukraine. First entering service in 1981, the Stinger is a man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS, developed by defense giant Raytheon. Russia first encountered these deadly platforms all the way back in 1985, during its invasion of Afghanistan. Back then, the US supplied the Afghan Mujahideen fighters with Stingers, which they put to remarkable use for the next few years. The Stinger hasn't changed much since then. It can engage a target from nearly 2.5 miles away, making it perfect for taking out low-flying aircraft and helicopters. The Stinger's missile is 5 feet long and 2.8 inches in diameter. The missile itself weighs 22 pounds, while the missile with its launch tube and integral sight fitted with a gripstock and identification friend or foe (IFF) antenna weighs approximately 34 pounds. The Stinger uses a smart seeker head able to differentiate between an enemy's exhaust plume and engines, helping it home in on even rapidly moving targets. The warhead itself is roughly 2.3 pounds of HTA-3 explosive, a deadly mix of HMX, TNT, and aluminium powder. This does not make the Stinger any less effective, however, since its targeting system allows it to strike the vulnerable engines of enemy aircraft. To fire the missile, a BCU, battery coolant unit, is inserted into the gripstock. This device consists of a supply of high-pressure argon gas, which is injected into the seeker to cryogenically cool it to operating temperature, and a thermal battery which provides power for target acquisition. A single BCU provides power and coolant for roughly 45 seconds, after which another must be inserted if the missile has not been fired. Guidance to the target is initially achieved through proportional navigation, but once in flight, switches to another mode, which is what allows the missile to avoid exhaust plumes. The answer to why the Stingers have been so effective against Russia this time around again has a lot to do with terrible military doctrine and planning. Russia has long struggled to integrate its use of air power with ground campaigns, something which Ukrainians have been exploiting for more than a year. Because Russia conducted its air sorties independently of ground advances, Ukraine was able to shoot down huge numbers of its low-flying vehicles with Stingers and other MANPAD systems. This was also not helped by Russia's basic lack of precision targeting. Most of its aircraft, especially older models, lack the modern targeting pods found on Western jets, meaning they have to dip low to have any hope of precise strikes on enemy positions. This leaves them extremely vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger, especially when they cannot detect where the missiles are coming from. Next, no video about US weapons would be complete without mention of the HIMARS system. This powerful rocket artillery system is one of the crown jewels of US aid to Ukraine, and in recent months, reports suggest they have become increasingly decisive in determining the direction of the war. HIMARS stands for High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, a variety of the MLRS rockets, which have been in use since the 1990s. The HIMARS are considered most effective for attacking stationary targets, such as infrastructure and troops in a concentrated area, but their extremely long range means that they can be used from far behind the front lines. As Ian Williams, Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has noted, HIMARS is one of the world's most advanced rocket artillery systems. Its range is farther than anything the Ukrainians had, so when that was transferred, they got the ability to strike targets deeper behind the front lines and much more accurately. Other experts largely concur, and many have pointed out that without the use of HIMARS, Ukraine would not have been able to liberate nearly as much territory as it has. HIMARS rockets have been particularly effective in fighting Russia's offensive in Donbass by allowing Ukraine to attack Russian supply and ammunition depots. They were also crucial in forcing Russia to withdraw from Kherson. George Barros, an analyst on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War, concluded that was only possible because the Ukrainians had this extended strike capability to degrade those bridges. Without the HIMARS, I don't think the Ukrainians would have liberated Kherson. And while it's certainly powerful, the HIMARS does not have either the range or payload of its cousin, the M270 MLRS. But what it lacks in range and firepower, the HIMARS more than makes up for in maneuverability. Its concept came about at the end of the Cold War, when it became apparent that the US military would be fighting more low-intensity conflicts in multiple environments. This led the Pentagon to move away from clunky, traditional rocket artillery and towards systems with a lighter footprint. It's this speed and maneuverability which has made the HIMARS so important for Ukraine's war effort. Faced with Russia's overwhelming numbers, Ukraine needed a platform able to rapidly deliver a payload and depart before it could be targeted with enemy counter-battery fire or airstrikes. Traditional artillery would most likely have been blown to bits before it could be moved, have let them launch numerous strikes without substantial retaliation, and once a HIMARS is fired, it usually finds its target. Each of its 6 GLMRS rockets has a range of 57 miles and is armed with a high-precision warhead. This means it can fire from well outside the range of traditional artillery and still hit its targets within several meters of accuracy. This has enabled Ukraine to strike at highly entrenched Russian positions, targeting their weakest points. HIMARS rockets can also each be set to independent targets, or used for repeated strikes on the same area of a fortification. Since Ukraine received its HIMARS, it has used them to take out everything from ammunition depots to command and control centers, managing to slow Russian advances to a crawl. Yet despite devoting large amounts of air power to taking out the missiles, Russia has apparently failed to touch 90% of them, instead losing more and more aircraft to Stingers every time it's tried. Part of the reason for this is that in addition to utilizing the HIMARS mobility, Ukraine also created multiple dummies, consisting of a generic heavy-duty truck frame, painted green and made to look as though it's carrying missiles. Ukraine has also apparently gotten so good at using HIMARS that it has actually been able to take out stalled tank columns, despite the system's intended use against stationary targets. As of last month, the US has supplied 38 HIMARS to Ukraine, but soon it may need more. Former Ukrainian Marine and captured British fighter Aidan Aslin recently told Newsweek that Russia appears to be hoarding its battlefield resources further away, out of HIMARS range. This suggests that the country will soon need more weapons with even greater reach, such as ATACMS or British Storm Shadow missiles. But experts also say the real advantage of sending different long-range missiles lies not in their individual capabilities, but in the numbers. The more missiles Kyiv can get its hands on, the more chances they have to strike Russian targets, and the more damage they can do. All of this suggests that while the war shows no signs of stopping soon, Russia remains unable to deal with the superior firepower the US has provided Ukraine. It's not likely to get any better anytime soon either. as Russia continues to run out of resources and trained personnel. But what do you think? Will more US weapons ultimately be what ends the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.